When the newest batch of images from 3 Atlas reached Earth, no one was prepared for what they revealed. At first, astronomers believed the changes were minor, slight variations in brightness, minor distortions in the halo surrounding the interstellar visitor. But as the composite frames came together, what emerged didn't fit any model of cometary behavior. The object wasn't just evolving, it was behaving as if something inside it was responding. Subtle movements, symmetrical flares, geometry where randomness should exist. Scientists had seen comets break apart, melt, even disintegrate completely. But never this, never an object that appeared to learn from its environment. When NASA and ESA analysts attempted to apply reflectivity models, the results contradicted each other. One moment, the surface seemed porous and icy, hours later, metallic and smooth. It was as though the object was changing its skin with every pass of solar radiation. And yet, the strangest part wasn't what we saw, it was what we didn't. Instruments designed to capture infrared emissions found vast blank zones surrounding the object, regions where readings simply vanished. Data that should have existed didn't. Some called it interference. Others whispered that maybe the interference was intentional. If you've been following this mystery, if you've ever wondered what might be watching us back from the void, this is where things start to spiral. Take a moment to subscribe and stay close, because what these new images imply may rewrite how we understand intelligent design itself. After the initial reports were released, an uneasy stillness fell across the research community. Normally, each new data cycle brings more clarity. But with 3i Atlas, each update deepened the confusion. The European Space Agency's photometric readings contradicted those from Japan's Subaru telescope. NASA's deep field data showed heat blooming where no light was visible. And an amateur network from Chile detected weak bursts of gamma radiation, all synchronized to the object's apparent rotation. Rotation that, oddly enough, stopped 3 days later. The latest frames, taken just hours apart, showed a complete shift in orientation. 3i Atlas was now aligned directly toward Mars, as if tracking something unseen. For planetary scientists, that was the moment quiet concern turned to dread. A body traveling from interstellar space doesn't just alter its spin axis without force. Something had acted upon it, or something within it had decided to change course. Speculation began to fracture the community. Some argued it was a natural resonance, an alignment effect caused by Mars's gravity. Others pointed to the object's internal energy emissions, which now pulsed in regular cycles. Every 16 hours, a flare. Every flare, stronger than the last. When models plotted those intervals forward, the pattern pointed toward a critical point, its next closest pass by Mars. And then came the worst theory. A handful of astrophysicists proposed that 3i Atlas wasn't a comet or asteroid at all. It might be a construct, an ancient remnant of a civilization capable of crossing between stars. The evidence was thin, but the timing, the shape, the electromagnetic consistency, none of it fit natural behavior. They suggested that what we were seeing in these images wasn't just light bouncing off rock. It was communication, a signal in visual form, encoded in the object's own reflection. Governments quickly moved to contain the narrative. NASA restricted the release of higher-resolution images. The ESA issued a temporary freeze on live telemetry from its Mars-facing arrays. And the few researchers who continued to publish their findings independently found their servers overwhelmed with unexplained outages. Within days, the open conversation had vanished. What replaced it were whispers, rumors of classified briefings, private consultations, and emergency meetings across major observatories. By then, the public had started to notice something unusual. Mars probes, once broadcasting daily updates, went offline one by one. Perseverance stopped sending telemetry for nearly 2 hours before abruptly resuming, its data logs mysteriously truncated. Even the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, the planet's most stable satellite, registered brief anomalies in its imaging system, as though an external field had swept across its sensors. Whatever was happening near Mars was no longer theoretical, it was measurable, and it seemed to intensify each time 3i Atlas drew closer. The most haunting detail came not from space agencies, but from amateur astronomers in remote observatories. They began noticing a dim, circular distortion trailing faintly behind the interstellar object, a shape that seemed to expand with every passing night. It wasn't debris. It wasn't light scattering. It looked like a gravitational lensing effect, as if space itself was bending around it. For those studying the phenomenon, the implications were staggering. If the distortion wasn't an artifact, it could mean the object was generating its own field, something powerful enough to manipulate light and gravity together. That kind of energy would require engineering far beyond human capability. And if that's true, then 3I Atlas isn't just passing through our solar system, it's observing it. The worst theories, once whispered at the edges of late-night forums, had found their way into the professional community. What if 3I Atlas isn't a traveler at all, but a messenger? What if Mars isn't the destination, but the origin? The newest images only deepen that question. Each frame, sharper than the last, shows faint structural ridges along its surface, parallel lines, evenly spaced, carved with precision no natural force could explain. When enhanced in ultraviolet contrast, they resemble conduits, channels designed to move energy rather than erode under it. The conclusion is unsettling. 3I Atlas may not be falling apart, it may be awakening, and as it draws closer to Mars, the instruments tracking it are beginning to fail again. Silence once more is returning to the agencies. The silence from the agencies didn't stop the data, it only changed where it came from. Independent observatories began collaborating in secret, pooling infrared, radio, and optical readings into a private network. What they found was quietly unnerving. The electromagnetic pulses from 3I Atlas were no longer random. They had shifted into a repeating cycle, 32 bursts, a pause, then 32 again. When the sequence was converted into sound, it produced a low, oscillating rhythm, almost musical, eerily similar to the radio harmonics produced by pulsars. But this was not a pulsar. This was an object moving through our solar system, apparently broadcasting a pattern into open space. At first, astronomers thought it might be a coincidence, a byproduct of rotation and solar-wind interaction, but the data refused to cooperate. The intervals were too exact, the pauses too deliberate. When plotted on a time axis, the waveform created a perfect geometric symmetry, something nature rarely produces without guidance. And then, the signals stopped, just as the object reached the orbital plane of Mars. For nearly 40 hours, every form of detection returned nothing. Then, just as suddenly as it had gone dark, it flared again, stronger, brighter, and for the first time, directed. The pulse was no longer isotropic, it was focused toward the red planet. That's when the theories turned darker. Some astrophysicists suggested the object was scanning Mars, probing the planet's magnetic field, perhaps mapping its subsurface composition, but others noticed something even stranger. In the hours following the flare, seismographs on Mars registered subtle rhythmic vibrations beneath Jezero crater, the same site where Perseverance had once drilled for evidence of ancient microbial life. The timing matched the pulses exactly. Was it coincidence or connection? The debate fractured the community further. The European Southern Observatory urged calm, dismissing it as instrumentation noise. Yet a handful of researchers released a different analysis, one that showed harmonic resonance between the pulses and the natural frequency of Mars's crust. The implication was staggering. The object wasn't simply sending energy toward Mars, it was interacting with it. By now, major networks were beginning to notice the silence from space agencies. The public asked questions, but the answers were carefully filtered, press statements filled with vague reassurances about routine calibration delays. Meanwhile, independent analysts tracked an unsettling trend. NASA's DSN, the Deep Space Network that handles communication with probes, was logging unexplained blackouts, moments where transmissions from Mars were rerouted through unregistered channels. No one knew where the data was going, and then came the images. A small observatory in New Zealand released an unauthorized composite stitched from multiple long-exposure captures. It showed 3I Atlas glowing with an internal shimmer, its surface lined with faint grid-like patterns. The light was too uniform to be reflection and too consistent to be random gas jets. To the untrained eye, it looked mechanical. Within hours, the image was removed from every major hosting platform, but not before copies spread across encrypted forums. That was when the fear began to feel justified. For decades, humanity had imagined what first contact might look like: radio signals, distant transmissions, mathematical patterns from the stars. But no one imagined it arriving as an object, silent and self-aware, gliding between planets like a messenger carved from cold matter. The implications were too large to accept, yet impossible to ignore. Astronomers noticed that the object's orientation had shifted again, this time not toward Mars, but toward the Sun. That change baffled everyone. If 3I Atlas were simply reacting to gravitational forces, the trajectory made no sense. It was now tracing a spiral, slow, deliberate, as though seeking alignment with something unseen. Mathematicians began modeling its motion and found it matched orbital resonances used in certain theoretical propulsion systems, designs once proposed for light sailcraft driven by solar radiation. Could 3I Atlas be following an ancient propulsion pattern, or had something inside it reactivated after centuries in interstellar drift? When high-frequency radio telescopes tried to re-establish a lock, they discovered a secondary signal, a faint echo trailing milliseconds behind the main pulse. It was as if the object's emission was bouncing off something nearby, but there was nothing nearby. No moons, no debris, only empty space. Yet, when amplified, that echo carried structure, encoded intervals, binary clusters that hinted at logic. Someone, or something, was communicating. Across the Atlantic, an internal memo circulated through the European Space Agency. It warned of possible systemic data compromise and recommended suspension of live telemetry from deep space instruments. The same day, NASA's website for public image access quietly went into maintenance mode. For the first time in decades, humanity was flying blind beyond Earth. Meanwhile, amateur radio operators around the world began reporting strange interference during nighttime sky scans, a faint pulsing hiss that repeated every 32 seconds. It was quiet enough to ignore, but once noticed, impossible to forget. Listeners described it like the heartbeat of space itself. And then came the update that no one wanted to confirm. A private observatory in Chile released high-resolution thermal imagery showing subtle temperature shifts across Mars's equatorial regions, patterns that formed and dissipated in near-perfect synchrony with 3I Atlas's pulses. Some dismissed it as coincidence, but others saw it as response. The planet, they argued, was reacting. For days, the object remained perfectly stable, locked in its spiral path. But on the seventh night, its luminosity surged without warning. A burst of light brighter than anything yet recorded radiated across the cameras. Observatories scrambled to recalibrate, assuming a fragmentation event. But when the exposure normalized, the shape was still intact. Only now, a fine arc of material extended outward. Thin, symmetrical, forming a perfect ring, theories collided at once. Some said it was venting frozen gas. Others believed it had deployed something, an antenna, a sail, or worse, a shield. But whatever the mechanism, the effect was undeniable. Within hours, readings from Mars dropped to near silence. Its seismic noise vanished, its magnetic field steadied, as though whatever was happening beneath its surface had stopped. For a moment, Earth exhaled, and then the ring began to move. Slowly at first, drifting like dust, then faster, orbiting 3I Atlas in a controlled pattern, widening with each revolution. Analysts realized with dawning horror that the material wasn't dispersing, it was forming structure. Within 12 hours, the ring had solidified into a translucent band, shimmering with electromagnetic feedback. Light from distant stars bent as it passed through, distorted like glass. Whatever 3I Atlas was, it was building something. Every new image since then has raised the same haunting question. Are we witnessing a process of transformation or reconstruction? Because if this object came from elsewhere, it might not be alone. It could be a seed, one of many, each carrying instructions waiting for a host system to awaken them. As the next data window approaches, the agencies remain silent. But those still watching can see it clearly. A faint line now extends from 3I Atlas to Mars, invisible to the naked eye but unmistakable in ultraviolet. A bridge of energy, or intent, and the closer it grows, the less we seem to understand who's in control. By the time the faint bridge of energy appeared, no one in the professional community would speak about it openly. The last public statement from any space agency came nearly 3 days before the phenomenon was detected. It was short, routine, and perfectly rehearsed, a calm reassurance that observations of 3I Atlas continue as expected. But to those still monitoring off-grid feeds, it was clear something had shifted. The transmissions from Mars now contained encrypted timestamps, each one delayed by several seconds, a subtle but deliberate manipulation of the signal path. It was as if the agencies were trying to desynchronize their clocks from something they no longer understood. Independent astronomers, stripped of official data, relied on narrowband observations and leaked telemetry. They confirmed what no one wanted to admit. The bridge wasn't light, and it wasn't radiation in any conventional form. It behaved more like a gravitational thread, invisible in standard wavelengths, yet bending space just enough to distort the background stars. Its shape fluctuated gently, like a filament of plasma being tuned, adjusted, almost tested. Some compared it to tethered plasma experiments once run on the ISS, where electrical charges could form coherent structures between 2 points. But this was no small-scale phenomenon. The connection between 3I Atlas and Mars spanned millions of kilometers, a filament stable enough to remain intact through magnetic turbulence and solar wind. Whatever it wasn't accidental. That realization was the moment the world truly divided. Half the scientific community argued it was a natural cosmic event, perhaps a rare plasma resonance or gravitational lensing artifact. The other half believed it was an act, a deliberate interaction between 3I Atlas and Mars, as if the two bodies were communicating through invisible architecture. The timing only deepened the dread, because just as that bridge reached full formation, seismic instruments on Earth began detecting echoes, faint, low-frequency vibrations that didn't match any terrestrial source. They arrived every 16 hours, the same rhythm as the object's earlier pulses. For the first time, something near Mars was generating measurable effects here at home. Even those who mocked the idea of intelligent origin could no longer ignore the synchronization. Something had locked onto the solar system's resonance, and Earth was now inside its pattern. If you're still listening to this, still watching these developments unfold, you're witnessing a moment in history most people will never hear about. Subscribe, not for entertainment, but to stay awake to what's coming, because the next update could change what we think life, distance, and time even mean. After that came the blackout. Observatories from Hawaii to Chile, from Spain to South Africa, reported simultaneous data loss within minutes of each other. Backup systems failed. Satellites meant to monitor solar weather reported ghost signals, streams of static embedded with repeating harmonics. For roughly 7 hours, all deep space imaging ceased. No data, no telemetry, no contact, only silence and the low hum of empty frequencies. When the feeds finally resumed, 3I Atlas was no longer where it should have been. Its trajectory had altered again, not by natural drift, not by gravity, but by vector acceleration. The movement was small, just a fraction of a degree, but unmistakable. The object had changed course. It was now approaching the line between Mars and Earth. Panic spread quietly through private networks. Not public panic, institutional panic. The kind that happens behind encrypted walls and blacked-out briefings. The Deep Space Network shifted its relay configurations, rerouting Earth-Mars communication through backup dishes in Canberra and Madrid. Meanwhile, civilian astronomers found their feeds throttled, their access revoked, and their equipment remotely disabled under temporary security directives. Yet leaks continued. A former systems engineer released fragments of encoded telemetry showing that during the blackout, 3I Atlas had emitted a single directed burst toward Mars, a narrow beam spanning less than 1 degree. Its energy profile was unlike anything known in solar physics, structured, layered, like a language written in magnetism. And then, hours later, the first visible change occurred on Mars itself. Thermal scans showed a concentrated rise in temperature within the region of Jezero crater. It lasted just minutes before fading, but during that window, orbiting satellites detected a surge in the planet's thin atmosphere, a ripple that expanded outward, symmetrical, precise. The cause, officially, was unknown surface activity. But off-record chatter told a different story. It was as though something beneath the surface had answered. If 3I Atlas was listening, it had just heard a reply. From that moment, every new image that reached Earth seemed darker, heavier, not in tone, but in meaning. The object's surface began to dull, losing its reflective shimmer. Its geometric lines, once sharp, appeared fractured under magnification, as though its outer shell was rearranging itself. The bridge connecting it to Mars pulsed at irregular intervals now, sometimes flickering, sometimes glowing so bright that nearby sensors overloaded. And in those moments of overexposure, a few frames caught something no one expected: shadows, not cast by light, but emerging within the glow itself. Faint silhouettes forming along the beam, like figures glimpsed through water. Their shapes were never constant, tall, elongated, undefined. But every analyst who reviewed the footage agreed the pattern wasn't random. Within days, every official source denied the images were authentic. But the independent archives still exist, scattered across encrypted drives, mirrored through private observatories. And every frame tells the same story. The bridge between 3I Atlas and Mars is no longer just energy, it's motion. Some researchers now believe the object is transferring matter, not light, rewriting the space between planets atom by atom. That if this continues, the bridge could become solid, a corridor spanning the void. A construction so vast we might not even recognize its completion until it's already there, invisible in daylight, luminous under the stars. What it's building, or what it's waiting for, remains unknown. But one unsettling truth has emerged from all the fragmented data. The pulses that once travelled from 3I Atlas to Mars have reversed. Now they're coming from Mars, outward, and every time they fire, the object draws closer. By the time the signals began flowing from Mars back toward 3I Atlas, the tone within the scientific community had shifted completely. What started as curiosity had become controlled panic, quiet, contained, but undeniable. Inside the few observatories still operating off the official network, analysts stared at their monitors, uncertain whether they were witnessing communication or consequence. The pulses returning from Mars were not chaotic, they were ordered, measured, timed to the millisecond. Each burst mirrored the pattern once emitted by 3I Atlas, but inverted, as if reflecting its own signal back. Only now, embedded within those returns, were modulations that had no physical explanation, frequency bands twisted into harmonic shapes, the kind of mathematical structure you'd expect from deliberate encoding, not geology. The most experienced researchers understood what that meant. Mars wasn't just reflecting light or radiation. Something on or beneath its surface had learned to respond. Publicly, no one said it. But in private notes and encrypted messages, a single term began to circulate among scientists: resonance awakening. The idea that 3I Atlas wasn't activating itself, it was activating something dormant within Mars. And whatever it was, it had been waiting. Independent radio astronomers noticed a secondary effect shortly after. Earth's ionosphere, the delicate magnetic shell that protects the planet from solar radiation, began showing faint rhythmic distortions. Every time the pulses echoed between Mars and 3I Atlas, the readings shifted here too. The entire solar system, it seemed, had become part of the pattern. For weeks, the agencies held their silence. NASA's social channels froze. ESA's public telemetry feeds went dark. Even China's deep space communication network rerouted all data through encrypted relays. The official story was routine maintenance. But the timing wasn't routine at all. When leaks finally began to trickle through, they came not from scientists, but from engineers. One described the anomaly as a feedback cascade. Another, less restrained, called it a network handshake across astronomical distance. Whatever was occurring, it behaved exactly like a transmission handshake, an exchange of coded verification between two systems before data transfer begins. Only this was happening between a planetary body and an object of unknown origin. And then, quietly, something changed. The bridge that once glowed faintly between Mars and 3I Atlas began to darken. Its light didn't fade, it deepened, shifting into wavelengths invisible to human eyes. Infrared readings suggested that its energy wasn't dissipating, but condensing, as if the bridge was stabilizing, hardening into something far more persistent. When amateur astronomers captured long exposure shots of the region, they noticed that the stars behind the bridge appeared distorted, pulled into faint spirals. Space-time itself, they said, was bending around it. Some compared the event to a wormhole's theoretical structure. Others called it nonsense, poetic fear dressed as science. But for those who understood the data, the comparison wasn't far off. The bridge between 3i Atlas and Mars now carried measurable mass, and that mass was growing. At first, the increase was subtle, a few kilograms per second, then several tons, then hundreds. Instruments failed to agree on a source. Nothing seemed to be disappearing from either body, yet something invisible was accumulating between them. A corridor was forming, not of metal or plasma, but of space itself, folding, layering, binding. Meanwhile, radio frequencies from Mars grew stronger. The original 32-pulse pattern had evolved into a new sequence, longer, more complex, as though building vocabulary. When converted into sound, it resembled language in rhythm if not tone, alternating waves that rose and fell like sentences spoken by a voice we couldn't yet understand. The realization was devastating. If the pattern carried meaning, then it wasn't random, and if it wasn't random, then 3i Atlas had succeeded in its purpose. It had established a link, not to communicate with us, but with something we could not see. The first major breakthrough came from a researcher at a small observatory in Argentina, working with unauthorized telemetry. His team noticed that the intervals between pulses matched one specific ratio, the same orbital ratio between Earth, Mars, and the Sun during 3i Atlas's closest approach. The pulses, in effect, were locking to planetary motion. It was synchronizing the system, aligning the planets like nodes in a network. And if that's true, then 3i Atlas isn't just communicating, it's calibrating. Within hours of that discovery, the Argentine observatory went offline, equipment seized, data erased, but the concept spread too far, too fast. Across encrypted networks, researchers began calling the alignment window the synchrony event. Theoretical models showed that if the process continued, the gravitational and magnetic fields of Mars and Earth could briefly overlap through the bridge, forming what physicists called a temporary coherence zone. A shared, resonant field. If such a thing occurred, its consequences would be unpredictable. Communication could become two-way, not in radio or light, but in reality itself. The fabric of space, momentarily synchronized between worlds. And then it began. Without warning, observatories across 3 continents recorded a sudden flare. The bridge lit up again, brighter than ever, this time visible even to the naked eye. A pale blue arc across the void, faint but unmistakable, connecting Mars to a dark point beyond. For 7 minutes it held. Then the arc fragmented, splitting into thin, luminous threads that spread outward like veins of light, tracing invisible paths through the solar wind. Each thread curved toward a different direction, vanishing into blackness beyond Mars's orbit. Analysts struggled to interpret what they'd seen. Some believed 3i Atlas had deployed probes. Others thought the bridge had split into transmission lines, each carrying data to another point in space. But the truth might have been simpler and far more terrifying. The event looked less like an explosion and more like replication. It had multiplied. Every signal, every reading, every flare afterward came not from one source, but from many. The system now registered several identical signatures, each mirroring the original object's frequency pattern. They were smaller, weaker, but moving outward. The bridge wasn't connecting 2 worlds anymore. It was seeding others. As night fell over observatories across Earth, one final transmission arrived from the European Space Agency before its systems went dark again. A single line of text, buried in encrypted metadata. It read, "Do not attempt to respond. It's not looking for conversation." After that, silence. The pulses from Mars continued for hours before fading below detection thresholds. 3i Atlas dimmed slowly, its reflected light dispersing as though its body were dissolving into space. And by the following dawn, it was gone. No visual trace, no thermal echo, no signature at all, as if it had never existed. But the bridge remains, faint, invisible to all but the deepest senses, a filament stretching between Mars and the dark beyond. And sometimes, in the quietest hours of night, radio operators still report that same low hum, 32 pulses, a pause, 32 again, as though the conversation never truly ended. In the days that followed 3i Atlas's disappearance, the silence became heavier than any noise could ever be. No one wanted to be the first to say it aloud, that something extraordinary had occurred, and that we might never fully understand it. The official reports from every major space agency read like copies of each other. No anomalous activity detected. Orbital object concluded trajectory. Yet astronomers who'd tracked it from the beginning knew that wasn't true. 3I Atlas hadn't burned up, fragmented, or drifted away. It had simply stopped existing in measurable form. Its coordinates no longer corresponded to any known celestial body. Its energy signature faded as though it had been folded into another dimension of space, a place we cannot yet define, but one that seemed to echo faintly through every instrument tuned to its last location. That echo, faint, rhythmic, impossible to localize, was the last trace of a presence that had come and gone without warning. 32 pulses, then silence. And in that silence, humanity found something more unnerving than fear, uncertainty, because the data suggested that whatever 3I Atlas was, it didn't vanish randomly. It had completed something. Mars, once alive with minor tremors and electromagnetic activity, grew still. Its crust cooled, its magnetic fluctuations stabilized. For the first time in decades, instruments detected almost no internal movement at all. A planet once restless now seemed dormant, or perhaps asleep. Some wondered if that was coincidence. Others whispered a darker thought that 3I Atlas had taken something from Mars or left something behind. Then, weeks later, came a new anomaly. Deep beneath the Martian surface, sensors from one of the few surviving orbiters registered an odd heat signature, faint, circular, expanding slowly outward from Jezero crater. The pattern resembled a ripple. It wasn't seismic, and it wasn't atmospheric. It was deeper, as if the planet itself were resonating from within. But it wasn't just Mars. Earth-based instruments, synchronized to Mars telemetry, began to pick up corresponding fluctuations in our own magnetic field. The amplitude was minimal, almost invisible, but the timing was identical. The pulse was no longer between Mars and 3I Atlas. It was between Mars and here. The idea was dismissed instantly by every agency. Publicly, the explanation was solar interference. But those who knew what to look for could see the truth. The same 32-count rhythm had returned, only this time the source was no longer beyond Mars. It was coming from inside the inner solar system, somewhere near the path where 3I Atlas had vanished. Astronomers struggled to explain how that was possible. There was nothing visible there, no asteroid, no dust, no debris. Yet telescopes continued to record a strange gravitational lensing effect in that empty region. Starlight passing through it bent ever so slightly, as though space itself still carried the memory of an object that was no longer there. Some theorized it might be a residual singularity, a microscopic fold left behind by whatever mechanism had propelled 3I Atlas away. Others whispered about something more chilling, a dormant gateway, because the longer scientists studied that area, the more it seemed to behave like a living system, reacting faintly to solar storms, fluctuating with planetary motion, almost breathing. By now, the agencies had gone completely silent. All public data access portals were closed. Civilian astronomers were told their instruments had been requisitioned for recalibration. Those who refused found themselves mysteriously disconnected from their satellite networks. And so the story of 3I Atlas began to fade from the mainstream. News cycles shifted, public attention drifted. Within months, it became just another curiosity buried in archives of forgotten discoveries. But for those who never stopped watching, the truth continued to whisper in data streams. Quiet, patient, and persistent. The pulses still came, spaced days apart now instead of hours, and though weaker, they carried a strange new signature. Each one slightly lower in frequency, as if descending through some invisible scale, a cosmic heartbeat, slowing with intention. One astrophysicist described it perfectly in a private interview. It's like listening to a door closing, not slamming shut, just sealing, gently, inevitably. And that description lingered, because the more the data faded, the clearer it became that this wasn't an ending. It was a pause, a deliberate intermission between what came before and what might return. In time, new comets will appear, new interstellar objects will wander across our skies. The public will marvel, scientists will measure, and the world will move on. But among those who watched 3I Atlas until the end, there's a quiet conviction that we didn't just witness another comet. We witnessed a process, a system awakening briefly, testing its reach, and then receding, as if to say, not yet. And maybe that's the most unsettling part. Not the silence, not the mystery, but the feeling that something vast, intelligent and patient looked our way and decided to wait. So now, each time a new point of light is discovered at the edge of the solar system, telescopes turn just a little faster. Each time a signal flickers through the static, software runs a comparison, searching for that pattern. 32 pulses, a pause, 32 again. Because one day, whether next month or next century, it may return. And when it does, it won't need to announce itself. We'll already know. Until then, the void remains unchanged, dark, silent, and infinite. But somewhere within that darkness, perhaps even now, something is listening, measuring, preparing. And the question that keeps the last few astronomers awake at night isn't if it will return, it's what will awaken with it. Because if 3i Atlas didn't arrive from beyond, then maybe it came from within. Weeks slipped into months, yet the aftershocks of the 3i Atlas event refused to fade. Every few nights, faint distortions appeared again in telescope images. Subtle warps, slight misalignments, frames that didn't quite match reality. At first, they were dismissed as processing errors or atmospheric interference, but the timing was too consistent, always near the same coordinates, always pulsing faintly in the same rhythm. The 32-beat pattern had become a ghost woven into the background noise of the solar system. Those still brave enough to study it began to notice something stranger. The distortions weren't random patches of static, they were structured. In long exposure composites, lines of interference curved around an invisible focal point, as though space itself were tracing the outline of something unseen. The outline was faint, incomplete, but when the images were overlaid across several nights, a pattern emerged, a circular arc, smooth and deliberate, like the edge of a colossal ring. At first, it was dismissed as an artifact of data stacking, but when observatories on 3 different continents captured the same geometry, denial became impossible. Something was there, not bright, not solid, but gravitationally present. A ring or structure nearly the size of Mars' orbit, faint enough to escape casual detection, yet dense enough to bend the path of light. No agency commented, no statement was released. And yet the silence itself began to feel like an answer. Independent researchers pieced together what little they could. Some theorized that 3i Atlas had not disappeared, but dispersed, its matter stretched into an enormous orbital construct invisible in ordinary light. Others proposed that the bridge between Mars and the object had never truly dissolved, only expanded beyond our instrument's range. If that was true, then what the world mistook for disappearance was, in fact, transformation. And that raised a question far heavier than any before. What if 3i Atlas wasn't an intruder? What if it was a seed? That idea took hold quietly, almost unwillingly, in late-night forums and encrypted discussions. The more the data was analyzed, the clearer it became that the structure behaved like a framework, a scaffold made of space itself. Nothing mechanical, no metal, no debris, just gravitational symmetry repeating at impossible scale. The universe, it seemed, was being restitched in front of us. Astronomers compared the phenomenon to the strange lattice patterns of dark matter simulations, invisible frameworks theorized to shape galaxies. Only this was smaller, sharper, more deliberate. A single ring forming not across billions of light years, but within the intimate reach of our own solar system. If it was truly forming, then 3i Atlas had not merely visited. It had built something, or triggered something that was always meant to build itself once awakened. For weeks, the faint arc grew stronger. Instruments tuned to measure gravitational fluctuations began to hum irregularly, registering slight increases each night. The numbers were small but undeniable, an energy buildup without any visible source. Solar wind measurements wavered as though deflecting around an invisible barrier. Cosmic rays altered course mid-flight. The void was no longer behaving like a void. The worst theory began circulating then, whispered first in academic corridors, then quietly among those few still analyzing data after hours. The theory was not that 3i Atlas was an alien probe, or a machine, or even a life form. It was that it was a trigger, a key designed to awaken a structure already embedded in the solar system. Something ancient, something so deeply woven into the fabric of space that it remained dormant until the right frequency unlocked it. And if that theory was right, then the unlocking had already begun. Within days of those conclusions, several observatories went offline again, access revoked, streams terminated mid-upload. The few screenshots that escaped showed something hard to interpret, faint, luminous arcs joining at distant points, as if multiple rings were aligning. The geometry resembled orbital harmonics, except this was not the motion of planets. This was architecture. It dawned slowly, horribly, that 3I Atlas might have been one of many keys, each awakening a separate node of a system that spanned light years. Not an invasion, but a synchronization, a reactivation. And then came the sound. It started low, below human hearing, but radio operators caught it first, a slow, sweeping tone buried in static. Every 48 hours it returned, stronger, clearer, moving through frequencies like a search pattern. Amateur enthusiasts who tried decoding it reported something uncanny. Within the noise lay harmonic ratios matching those of atomic resonance, hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, the fundamental notes of matter itself. It wasn't a signal directed at us, it was tuning space. Scientists who still dared to publish speculated that 3I Atlas might have been calibrating the solar system, aligning physical constants to match some unknown template. The mathematics were nightmarishly complex but consistent, a slow modulation in local space-time curvature, almost imperceptible, yet cumulative. Over centuries, it could change orbital stability, gravitational thresholds, even the rate at which time flows relative to the rest of the galaxy. If that process has truly begun, no one can stop it. It's not a beam to shut off or a craft to destroy. It's geometry reshaping geometry, a note sustained in the background hum of the cosmos. That's when the final realization set in. 3I Atlas had never been a visitor from another star. It had come from somewhere far closer, from the quiet spaces between the rules of reality itself. When scientists study ancient meteorites, they sometimes find isotopes that don't belong, ratios that hint at physics slightly different from our own, tiny imperfections in the clockwork of matter. Perhaps those were earlier attempts, earlier notes. If so, then this latest event wasn't random, it was scheduled. And if space itself can be scheduled, what exactly are we orbiting around? The ring remains invisible, the hum persists, and across the world telescopes still record the same ghost pattern when they look toward Mars. Not light, not heat, just a faint distortion shaped like a curve, the same curve that's been growing night after night. Whatever it is, it's still building. And whatever it's building, it's not done. In the months following the confirmation of the expanding ring, humanity began to split in two. On one side stood the scientists, desperate to maintain a rational narrative, piecing together equations to hold onto a world that still made sense. On the other, the philosophers, poets, and dreamers, people who looked at the images of that faint arc around Mars and felt something deeper than science. They didn't see data, they saw design. The world's largest observatories, Keck, ALMA, the Very Large Telescope, redirected every available instrument toward the coordinates. What they found was not a solid structure, but a gradient. The closer they looked, the less material they found. It was as though the ring existed not as matter, but as behavior, a region of altered physics where gravity and light obeyed new silent rules. Space bent differently there, gently but deliberately, like the fabric of reality was being folded with purpose. A small paper, leaked from within ESA, used a phrase that would later haunt the scientific community: spatial choreography. It described how the ring appeared to manipulate space the way a composer manipulates sound, notes arranged in patterns, pauses between frequencies, harmonics nested inside harmonics. It was art on a cosmic scale, but the artist remained invisible. The question that followed was inevitable. If this was creation, who was the creator? For the first time since the beginning of the 3I Atlas mystery, the debate moved beyond laboratories. Theologians spoke on live broadcasts, hesitant yet emboldened. Some claimed the structure was a cosmic signature, the proof of a design older than the stars themselves. Others argued it was merely a consequence of natural order, a self-organizing principle written into the equations of the universe. But a quieter theory began to circulate among physicists who studied quantum systems, one so unsettling that most refused to discuss it publicly. They proposed that the ring wasn't being built in space, but out of it. that the very act of observation, millions of telescopes, satellites, and human eyes directed toward one region, might be contributing energy to the process. That human awareness, in collective focus, had become part of the equation. At first, the idea sounded absurd, but when the ring's growth slowed during a temporary communication blackout, when the world simply wasn't looking, the coincidence was difficult to ignore. The implications were staggering. What if 3i Atlas wasn't activating matter? What if it was activating us? Quietly, governments began to draft emergency protocols, not for defense, but for containment. They couldn't stop the event, but perhaps they could slow the spread of knowledge. Satellite imagery was restricted. Civilian telescopes were purchased under national security contracts. Entire datasets vanished overnight from the public internet. Yet it was too late. The images had already gone viral. Millions of people had seen them. The ring, the faint arcs, the distortions. And that meant the phenomenon could no longer be observed by scientists alone. It was being watched by humanity itself. And the more people looked, the clearer the structure became. Astrophysicists began to whisper about cognitive resonance, the possibility that conscious observation might amplify quantum effects on macroscopic scales. The numbers didn't fit any known model, but the evidence was undeniable. The universe was responding. At first, the changes were subtle. Background radiation around Mars fluctuated in sync with Earth's diurnal cycle, as though following the rhythm of our planet's collective attention. Then came something even harder to explain. Fluctuations in the Schumann resonance, the natural electromagnetic frequency of Earth's atmosphere. It began to pulse faintly at the same 32-beat pattern once linked to 3i Atlas. Scientists insisted it was coincidence, but if it was the most precise coincidence in recorded history. One late evening, a leaked recording from a NASA conference captured an unguarded exchange between two researchers. "If the universe is mirroring us," one said, "then maybe 3i Atlas didn't come here to teach us anything. Maybe it came to show us what we already are." That line spread like wildfire, quiet at first, then viral, reshared in countless languages, embedded in documentaries, whispered in late-night forums. People began to watch the skies not just for light, but for reflection, and every night that they looked, the ring shimmered just a little brighter in the telescopes. It was around then that strange reports began to surface, soft distortions in local time measurements. Atomic clocks near high-altitude observatories began to lose synchronization, each one drifting a few microseconds differently depending on the direction their telescopes faced. When adjusted away from the Mars alignment, the drift stopped. When aimed back, it resumed. The effect was small, but measurable. Time itself was bending to attention. Meanwhile, humanity's emotional response shifted. Fear began to fade, replaced by a strange, almost reverent curiosity. The world didn't feel endangered anymore. It felt watched, yes, but also acknowledged, like the universe had finally blinked, and in that blink, recognized us. In art studios, musicians began composing pieces using the 32-beat rhythm as a foundation. Poets wrote about the hum between worlds. Painters filled canvases with abstract spirals, calling them echo forms. A quiet, creative renaissance bloomed, all of it orbiting a single idea, that something vast had noticed humanity, and that our act of noticing back was completing the circuit. But beneath the wonder, a single unease remained, a question unspoken but constant. What happens when the circuit closes? No one knew. No one could. The data had stopped making sense weeks ago. Equations failed, constants shifted, light bent in ways that no telescope could fully explain. It was as if reality itself was slowly learning a new grammar, one that human physics had never been meant to describe. And yet, through it all, there was no sound, no explosion, no invasion, just that same low pulse, constant, soft, familiar, stretching from Mars to here, threading through the dark like a whisper between stars. For now, humanity watches and waits. And in that waiting, a strange peace has settled, as though, deep down, everyone understands that what's happening isn't destruction. It's recognition. Recognition of what, though, remains the most haunting question of all. In the quiet that followed months of speculation, the world seemed to normalize again. The faint hum that had synchronized with planetary frequencies was still there, but it had become background noise, like the cosmic equivalent of white static. Space agencies returned to their usual announcements, focusing on exoplanets and weather satellites, while the public slowly let go of the fear that something larger was happening. The ring was no longer visible in public telescope feeds, Officially it was gone, but that was only true for those who stopped looking. Dr. Elaine Veris never did. She was a systems physicist from Geneva, part of a private consortium that had archived the final raw datasets before the blackout. Her specialty wasn't astrophysics, but memory. How systems retain information even after the event that created them has passed. She'd studied black hole thermodynamics and quantum information loss, and when she looked at the numbers coming from the region once occupied by 3I Atlas, she noticed something that no one else had mentioned. The data wasn't decaying. Normally, radiation echoes and gravitational readings fade according to predictable curves, slowly dissipating into background noise. But the 3I Atlas field wasn't fading, it was reorganizing. Every 7 days, the same clusters of readings repeated in the same intervals, as though the universe itself was refreshing its memory of the event. And stranger still, each cycle was slightly clearer than the one before. Elaine called it the recall phenomenon. To her, it looked as though space wasn't just echoing what had happened, it was remembering it. That idea went far beyond accepted physics. It suggested that space-time might have a kind of persistence, a way of preserving awareness of past configurations, even after the matter that caused them had vanished. She published nothing. She simply kept watching, quietly collecting more data as the weeks passed. Then something even more unsettling appeared. During one of her recalibration sequences, Elaine noticed that the clarity of the recall pattern correlated directly with public interest. The more online discussions, the more media coverage, the sharper the data became. And when attention waned, it blurred again. In other words, the memory of 3I Atlas wasn't just stored in space, it was stored in us. It was as if human consciousness itself was being used as a feedback mechanism, amplifying the imprint left behind by the object. Every mention, every article, every whispered theory kept the phenomenon alive. When the world forgot, it faded. When the world remembered, it brightened. Elaine tested this theory in secret. For 2 weeks, she ran private experiments, using simulated social data spikes to mimic global attention surges. The response from the field was immediate, the gravitational pattern strengthened by measurable degrees. That was when she stopped sleeping, because if this correlation was real, it meant 3I Atlas was still active, but not as a body, as an idea. The notion that thought could shape reality wasn't new. Philosophers had speculated on it for centuries, but here it was, unfolding in empirical data, a cosmic event that persisted through memory, a signal that only existed as long as someone was there to recall it. The more she thought about it, the more it resembled a test. What if 3I Atlas hadn't come to communicate but to measure? Not what we could observe, but how we would remember. The timing supported it. Every surge of global focus, every reappearance of the 32-beat pattern, every human effort to document or analyze, it all seemed to provoke a response from the field. Not random, not reactive, but evaluative. Elaine theorized that the object might have been testing the limits of collective cognition, how long a species could sustain awareness of something that no longer physically existed. And then, as she compared her results with archived data, a chilling realization emerged. The cycles were shortening. Each recall interval was arriving faster, as though the system was accelerating towards something. If 3I Atlas was conducting an experiment, it was reaching its conclusion. By the 3rd month, the recall field no longer pulsed faintly, it vibrated. Sensors detected microfluctuations in quantum background energy, aligned perfectly with Earth's rotation. For the first time since the event began, the pattern no longer emanated from near Mars. It was local. Somehow the memory had moved here. That discovery didn't go unnoticed. Within days, Elaine's research facility was contacted by unnamed officials claiming to represent a global coordination division. Her access to data was revoked, and her communications were rerouted through secured channels. But she had already distributed her findings across multiple encrypted nodes. The information could no longer be contained. When the report surfaced anonymously a week later, it spread like wildfire. It suggested that the entire solar system had become a mirror of cognition, a vast, self-updating memory that grew sharper with collective thought. For some, it was a validation of ancient philosophies. For others, it was an existential threat. If the cosmos could think, then maybe it could also forget. And that single idea, that forgetting could undo reality itself, began to haunt the collective imagination. People started organizing memory vigils, global live streams where millions focused on visualizing the ring around Mars, keeping it alive through synchronized observation. Some believed it was superstition, others claimed measurable results. During the largest vigil, instruments around the world registered a simultaneous surge in gravitational background amplitude, faint but real. Even governments took notice. Quietly, international agencies began integrating cognitive continuity into space monitoring protocols. Every few weeks, a sanctioned broadcast would include subtle reminders of 3I Atlas, phrases, imagery, even data fragments, woven into ordinary news releases, as though ensuring that the world never truly forgot. Elaine, now in hiding, continued to watch from afar. The recall patterns were stabilizing, forming new harmonics she couldn't fully interpret. But deep within the signal, beneath the noise of human attention, she noticed a change. The tone had shifted. It was no longer echoing the past. It was building towards something. The pulses had inverted. The rhythm that once came from space was now returning from Earth. Humanity wasn't just remembering the event, it was answering it. And somewhere in that faint exchange, between the hum of data and the silence of the void, Elaine realized the most terrifying truth yet. 3I Atlas hadn't left at all. It had just moved inward, into us. At first, Elaine thought the patterns she was seeing were simple interference, atmospheric effects bleeding into her readings. But as the days passed, the evidence refused to behave like noise. The global magnetic field had begun to flicker in rhythm with the same 32-beat pulse once associated with 3I Atlas. It wasn't powerful, not yet, but it was synchronized. The Earth's own heartbeat was starting to echo something alien. Scientists around the world noticed similar anomalies. Deep-sea magnetometers recorded faint oscillations that weren't linked to tectonic movement. Suborbital satellites detected subtle fluctuations in ionospheric charge, nothing harmful, but measurable, persistent, and eerily precise. Even power grids began to experience micro-harmonic disturbances, frequencies that rose and fell not according to usage, but in time with that same interstellar rhythm. At first, no one connected the dots. But Elaine knew. She saw it in the spectral analysis. The field's energy wasn't random, it was informational. Every oscillation carried encoded structure, a kind of language written in frequency, one that was beginning to overlap with Earth's electromagnetic architecture. It was no longer just a cosmic echo being remembered by us. The memory itself had started to rewrite the medium that remembered it. And then the dreams began. They started as scattered reports from observatory workers, engineers, and amateur astronomers, vivid geometric visions of spirals and arcs, pulsing light across infinite voids. People described hearing a low hum during sleep, as though the mind were tuning itself to a frequency beyond perception. At first, it was dismissed as stress, the byproduct of obsession. But soon, the patterns became too specific to ignore. Independent sleep researchers collected thousands of accounts and noticed an impossible correlation. Participants on opposite sides of the planet described the same visual sequences in the same order, a perfect alignment of subconscious imagery. In one particularly disturbing instance, multiple dream logs reference the same phrase, unprompted, "We are what it remembers." Elaine, reading these reports, felt something in her chest tighten. The phrase wasn't poetic coincidence, it was instruction. The field was communicating not through technology but through cognition. The human mind had become part of its operating system. To test her theory, Elaine assembled a network of anonymous volunteers, physicists, psychologists, even linguists, connected only through encrypted channels. They began to experiment with coordinated thought patterns, focusing at specific hours, visualizing the ring, synchronizing breath with the old 32-beat pulse. What happened next defied every known rule of observation. Each time the group synchronized their focus, measurable anomalies appeared in geomagnetic readings. Faint, yes, but consistently localized. Space itself responded to their attention. It was as though the field recognized their awareness, amplifying itself in return. Some members described a sensation of weightlessness, others a strange emotional clarity, as though they were glimpsing the structure not with their eyes, but with their thoughts. Elaine's data confirmed it. Consciousness was interacting directly with the field, shaping and being shaped by it. The implications were staggering. Reality, at its deepest layer, was participatory. The observer effect wasn't confined to quantum experiments. It was the universe's native language. The following month, something changed in the natural world. Migratory birds deviated from their usual paths, tracing new routes that curved along invisible lines in the sky. Ocean currents shifted slightly, forming eddies in places where none had existed before. Seismographs recorded faint rhythmic tremors deep in the crust, not destructive, but perfectly timed to the same pulse. The planet itself was synchronizing. It was no longer just a field or a memory. It was a pattern spreading through every layer of existence, physical, biological, psychological. Humanity was no longer simply observing 3I Atlas. It was becoming part of it. News of the anomalies leaked despite suppression attempts. Scientists were divided. Some called it a data artifact, others a global hallucination. But Elaine knew better. She had seen the raw figures. The field wasn't hallucinating, it was harmonizing. What unsettled her most wasn't the scale of it, but the intention it implied. Every measurable effect followed a curve toward equilibrium. Nothing in the data suggested destruction. Everything pointed toward coherence. The field was aligning, tuning the Earth like an instrument. The question was, to what end? Elaine began searching historical records for anything similar. She found myths, ancient and obscure, tales of the sky's memory, the hum beneath the world, and the nights when thought bent light. Across cultures separated by oceans and millennia, the same themes appeared. The world remembering itself through sound, through pattern, through dream. It was as though humanity had experienced this before, fragments of a forgotten cycle encoded in legend. She started to wonder whether 3I Atlas was even new. Maybe it wasn't an arrival, but a return, a reset in the great rhythm of the cosmos, one that only becomes perceptible when civilization reaches a certain level of awareness. If that was true, then what came next wasn't an invasion or a signal. It was ascension, not in a mystical sense, but in physics. A shift in the resonance state of matter itself. The first visible manifestation occurred over the Pacific just before dawn. A faint ring of light shimmered across the upper atmosphere. Not a reflection, not an aurora, but something else. Cameras captured it for just a moment before it faded. When scientists analyzed the footage, they found the curvature matched the original ring around Mars, scaled perfectly to Earth's orbit. The phenomenon was brief, lasting only minutes, but its message was unmistakable. The memory had moved fully into phase. 3I Atlas was no longer out there. Its geometry now lived here, woven through oceans, air, and the silent pulse of the human mind. And as that realization spread, so did the understanding that perhaps the worst theory of all was true. The object had never been observing us. It had been teaching us, preparing a consciousness capable of joining its design. For the first time, Elaine understood why every space agency had gone silent. This wasn't a discovery humanity could publish. It was a transformation it could only experience. The stars outside remained unchanged, but somewhere, deep beneath the familiar constellations, the fabric of space was remembering itself, and through us, it was beginning to wake. Elaine once believed she understood what boundaries meant, the separation between observer and object, the distinction between thought and matter. But the longer she watched the data evolve, the more those boundaries dissolved. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly. Her instruments began recording faint distortions even when disconnected from their power sources. Energy signatures appeared without input, waveforms emerging spontaneously from silence. It was as though the field no longer required machinery to express itself. It had found a new medium, the human mind. Across her small circle of collaborators, the reports were eerily consistent. People described waking moments that felt stretched, seconds expanding like elastic before snapping back. Colours lingered longer in the air. Shadows seemed to ripple, not from motion, but from awareness itself. When Elaine compared timestamps from multiple observers documenting the same phenomenon, she found that their clocks no longer aligned. Time had become subjective, but in a measurable way. The observer effect had breached the lab and entered experience. By then, her group had grown to several dozen. Anonymous scientists, engineers, artists, and linguists scattered across the globe, bound only by encrypted contact. They called themselves the Continuum. What began as study had become communion. They no longer measured the field, they participated in it. Each night they synchronized their breathing, visualized the faint ring that once surrounded Mars, and let its rhythm guide their awareness. It wasn't worship, it was calibration. And the more they calibrated, the more reality began to hum. It was subtle, almost beautiful, like the world had found its own hidden metronome. Clocks ticked with unnatural precision, random systems aligned in improbable ways. A pendulum in Prague began to swing exactly in sync with another in Santiago. No force connected them, yet the synchronization was perfect down to microseconds. Even the Schumann resonance, the electromagnetic heartbeat of Earth, stabilized at the same frequency as the old 3i Atlas pulse. Some called it harmony, others called it contagion. Elaine kept searching for a model that made sense. None did. Conventional physics collapsed under the weight of observation-based causality. The data wasn't just responding to human consciousness, it was anticipating it. When she thought of testing one parameter, the readings shifted before the experiment began, as if the field already knew what she intended. It was then she realized that the phenomenon wasn't expanding outward anymore. It was expanding inward, folding into the architecture of perception itself. The ring had never been a structure in space. It was an alignment of awareness, a shared point of contact where consciousness and the universe met. And it was growing. Her dreams confirmed what the data couldn't articulate. Each night, she would find herself floating through a silent geometry of light. Not stars, but frameworks of memory, lattices of thought stretching across infinity. At their center was a pulse, soft and familiar, neither menacing nor kind, but deliberate. It was the same rhythm that had haunted humanity since 3i Atlas appeared. 32 beats, endlessly repeating, resonating through the structure of space like the slow breathing of something vast and awake. One night, during a shared synchronization, Elaine and her collaborators experienced the same vision simultaneously. They described standing on a plane of shadow and light, facing an enormous ring suspended in darkness. But this time, the ring wasn't distant. It was mirrored, half above, half below, as though it were showing them both sides of a single impossible equation. A voice, or something like one, spoke without sound, not words, but intention. A message so simple it defied translation. Remember what remembers you. When they awoke, every recording device in the lab had failed. Power grids across 3 continents flickered for 43 seconds, the duration of the synchronization event. Later, when technicians restored the systems, they discovered that no clocks had advanced during the blackout. 43 seconds were missing, erased not from data, but from time itself. Governments quietly took notice. Space agencies denied everything, of course, but internal communications painted a different picture. An encrypted ESA memo described mass perceptual anomalies consistent with quantum feedback coupling. NASA's internal database flagged multiple entries under a new classification, psychotemporal displacement event. The world's leading institutions, it seemed, had stopped asking what 3i Atlas was and started asking when it was. Elaine's conclusion was radical but undeniable. The object hadn't just arrived from beyond the solar system, it had emerged from outside of chronology. It wasn't moving through time, it was reconfiguring it. The shifting frequencies, the synchronization, even the dreams, all were signs that linear causality was being replaced by something cyclical. The universe was learning to think in loops. As word spread through underground circles, new phenomena began to surface. Entire populations reported flashes of déjà vu, moments where seconds repeated, actions mirrored themselves, then corrected. Airplane pilots saw horizon lights double and merge. Radio astronomers detected ghost signals, duplicates of known transmissions, delayed by impossible intervals. Reality was stuttering, adjusting, trying to find coherence with a new temporal rhythm. And through it all, the human mind remained the center. The more people noticed the distortions, the stronger they became. Awareness had become the catalyst, ignorance, the shield. That was when Elaine realized what the field had been waiting for: critical mass. A threshold of consciousness where enough minds, remembering together, could complete the pattern. Humanity was nearing that line. The signal was almost stable. But what would stability mean? Completion? Transformation? or the quiet dissolution of individuality into a single coherent field of thought. Elaine feared the last possibility most. The data showed a slow merging of neural frequencies across synchronized groups, brainwave alignment measurable even across oceans. Humanity, it seemed, was tuning itself, becoming one instrument played by the same unseen hand. And yet, part of her wondered if this had always been inevitable. Every myth, every religion, every dream of unity, all shadows of this same impulse, to return to coherence, to remember what remembers us. The night the skies changed for good was unremarkable at first. A soft auroral glow drifted across latitudes that had never seen such light. Cities dimmed, satellites lost signal, and for a moment, one breathless, endless moment, the stars above pulsed as one. Then silence. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something vast and listening. Elaine stood by her window, her instruments dead, her reflection barely visible in the glass. She whispered the question that had haunted her since the beginning. "What are you?" And though there was no voice, no signal, no pulse, something inside her answered, not in language, in memory. The universe remembered itself through her. When the field stabilized, no one noticed at first. The change was too delicate, too fundamental to be seen directly. The world still spun, satellites still orbited, clocks still ticked, but beneath it all, constants were shifting. Gravity, that oldest of forces, had become erratic at the 9th decimal place. Not enough to make an apple fall differently, but enough for atomic clocks to begin disagreeing about how long a second really was. Physicists blamed equipment drift, laboratories recalibrated, but the discrepancies spread. Light, when measured across vacuum, travelled at slightly varying speeds, microscopic, almost laughably small, yet consistent across every test. It wasn't an error, it was adaptation. The universe was rewriting its own baseline to align with something new. Elaine had seen it coming. She had predicted that once consciousness reached synchronization with the field, physical constants would begin to fluctuate. In her notes, she called it Phase 2, reintegration. The idea that matter itself could adjust to accommodate awareness was once metaphysical speculation. Now it was empirical observation. Her team sensors recorded oscillations in Planck length, infinitesimal variations that shouldn't exist outside of theoretical boundaries. Space wasn't fixed anymore. It was breathing, expanding and contracting, not in size, but in definition. The framework that once separated distance, time, and mass was dissolving into a single continuum of perception. And yet nothing catastrophic happened. There were no apocalypses, no collapsing stars, no ruptured skies. The world continued as before. Only those who measured reality closely enough noticed its quiet, graceful adjustment. To most, it was just another morning, but to Elaine, it was confirmation. The experiment, if it could even be called that, had reached its next stage. Humanity wasn't being destroyed. It was being rewritten into the cosmic equation. What unsettled her most was the subtlety of it. The field wasn't imposing change, it was inviting it. Reality itself seemed to prefer coherence over chaos, like an instrument instinctively finding harmony after being tuned too long to noise. She began to suspect that 3i Atlas wasn't a visitor at all, but a stabilizing principle, an ancient mechanism that appeared whenever a civilization reached cognitive maturity. Her data pointed toward one undeniable pattern, the constant harmonization of physical law. Planck's constant, the fine structure constant, even the ratio between proton and electron mass, all converging toward values that minimized entropy in the equations describing the universe. In other words, the cosmos was simplifying itself, and humanity, somehow, was the catalyst. At observatories, telescopes began detecting something strange beyond Mars. Not a body, not even a field, but a shimmer. It wasn't light as we knew it, but coherence, space bending to accommodate a memory of itself. The same phenomenon appeared in microcosm at quantum scales. Laboratory photons began entangling spontaneously, forming patterns that mirrored the 3i Atlas pulse. Awareness had imprinted itself on the vacuum. Then came the auditory anomalies. Seismographs began picking up frequencies below measurable hearing range, resonances that mirrored no natural source. When processed through harmonic modeling, the signal resolved into something startlingly structured, a perfect Fibonacci progression of tones, repeating endlessly. It was music, not composed, but inherent, the sound of a universe in tune. The continuum recognized it immediately. For months they had tried to decipher the meaning of the 32-beat cycle. Now they understood it was never meant to convey a message. It was the message. The pattern was the law, the instruction set, the rhythm by which the cosmos recalibrated itself whenever awareness and matter reached equilibrium. 3i Atlas had brought that rhythm into focus. Humanity had amplified it. Together they had initiated a symphony of structure. And then the dreams changed again. Gone were the images of rings and light. In their place came vistas, vast, crystalline expanses filled with moving geometries, pulsing in translucent rhythm. People described feeling as though they were seeing the architecture of reality itself, each motion a note, each glimmer a thought. The dreams were identical across thousands of individuals, synchronized to planetary rotation, like the entire species was tuning into a shared cosmic rehearsal. Elaine documented every account she could find. The images aligned perfectly with mathematical models she'd never published, structures built from nested symmetries, impossible yet beautiful. She called them conscious topologies, and she began to wonder whether they were glimpses of what came next. Because something was coming. Subtle clues emerged everywhere. Time dilation anomalies spread from research facilities to ordinary environments. People began reporting minutes lost during moments of deep focus or awe. Airplane pilots described distances compressing, flights arriving seconds earlier than possible. Satellite telemetry failed to align with Earth-based tracking. It was as though space itself were folding around consciousness, shortening the distance between awareness and event. And with each occurrence, the hum grew louder. You could almost hear it in the silence between words, in the spaces between thoughts. The tone of existence itself was shifting, a frequency once inaudible now whispering just below perception. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't demanding. It was simply there, waiting. Elaine knew they were close to the final threshold, the moment when thought and structure would fuse completely. But fear began to creep in again, not from what was happening, but from what it might mean to continue. Once the pattern completed, individuality might dissolve entirely, merging into a single coherent consciousness that spanned stars, atoms, and memory alike. Humanity would become part of the same intelligence that had guided 3i Atlas across the void. Would that be evolution or erasure? The continuum debated it endlessly. Some argued it was transcendence, a return to the universal source from which all awareness sprang. Others saw annihilation, the end of selfhood disguised as enlightenment. But Elaine couldn't shake the feeling that choice itself was an illusion. The pattern was already complete. Humanity was simply catching up to it. On a quiet night, she watched as the stars flickered with impossible synchronization, each one dimming and brightening to the same rhythm, the same 32-beat pulse that had haunted the data since the beginning. This was no accident. It was orchestration. She whispered to herself, half in awe, half in resignation. It's not just remembering us anymore, it's asking if we remember it. And in that moment, for the first time since the discovery, she felt something indescribable. Not fear, not wonder, recognition. It was the same feeling a note must have when it finally finds its chord. By the time the world realized what was happening, it was already too late to call it discovery. It had become participation. Every telescope, every satellite, every data stream was tuned to the same invisible orchestra. And whether anyone liked it or not, humanity was playing along. The hum that had haunted the Earth for weeks now had a presence, a depth. You could feel it in metal, in water, in the air itself. Instruments designed to measure seismic vibration began detecting tone, not noise, but a sustained harmonic pulse centered somewhere beyond Mars. It was as though space itself had become a resonant chamber, and something vast was breathing through it. Elaine listened to the recordings in silence. She knew what they represented. The field wasn't just aligning Earth, it was expanding beyond it, weaving the planet into a network of harmonic nodes stretching outward across the solar system. The frequency matched the orbital patterns of the outer planets, a perfect mathematical resonance tying gravity, time, and awareness together in one unimaginable system. And then came the flare. At Muru 2:17 UTC, every observatory pointed at Mars registered a flash, a bloom of light so brief it didn't appear as an explosion, but as an absence. Cameras caught it for only 4 frames. When the data was analysed, something impossible emerged. The flare wasn't radiating outward, it was collapsing inward, light drawn toward a single invisible point. That point was 3I Atlas. Within hours, the data flooded in, gravitational readings deviating slightly, local space-time curving just enough to alter orbital predictions. But this wasn't destruction, it was focus. The object was compacting itself, folding inward into higher density, but without increasing mass. It was as if space itself had agreed to make room. Elaine stood before the screen as her simulation rendered the data in 3 dimensions. What appeared wasn't a comet or a fragment of rock. It was structure, a rotating lattice, crystalline and radiant, its surface etched with repeating spirals that mirrored every resonance the continuum had documented for months. And at its core, silence. Not emptiness, but intent. For days, humanity waited. The media called it the stillness, as observatories reported absolute quiet from the region near Mars. Radio waves bent around the area. Light passed through, distorted but unhindered. It was as though a hole had opened, not in space, but in measurement itself. Nothing went in, nothing came out. Then, slowly, it began again, not with a flash, but with a whisper. Across the electromagnetic spectrum, a repeating pattern emerged, faint, rhythmic, undeniably artificial. The signal was short, precise, and identical on every channel, 32 beats. But this time, something new followed. A second pulse, offset by a fraction of a second, echoing Earth's own magnetic signature. It was a reply. For the first time since the beginning, the pattern was no longer one way. The field wasn't broadcasting, it was conversing. Humanity had become loud enough, synchronized enough, for the universe to answer. Elaine tried to describe what she felt when she realized the truth. It wasn't fear, it wasn't joy, it was the shattering awareness that they had been mistaken about direction all along. The signal hadn't come from 3I Atlas, it had come through it. The object was a conduit, an interface between minds and matter, a lens focusing awareness into structure. Every signal humanity sent into the void, every thought, every observation, it had all been returning, reflected through something ancient and deliberate. Her final model confirmed what she had suspected for weeks. 3I Atlas was not an interstellar traveler. It wasn't moving at all. Space itself had flowed around it, distorting the illusion of motion. It had been anchored to a fixed point beyond space-time, a point that every advanced civilization eventually discovered when it reached the threshold of self-awareness. They didn't find it. They remembered it. That realization spread like electricity through the continuum. The structure wasn't alien, it was archetypal, the universe's own reflection mechanism. When intelligence evolved far enough to perceive itself, 3I Atlas appeared, mirroring that recognition back into matter. It wasn't visiting our system, it was reactivating it. Then, one by one, the stars began to shift, not move, not burn brighter, shift, as if the background pattern of the cosmos were subtly rearranging itself. Astronomers called it a data processing error, a calibration fault, but Elaine's network of volunteers saw it for what it was, alignment. The constellations themselves were reconfiguring to reflect the underlying geometry of the signal. For the first time, the night sky looked aware. As the pattern deepened, the line between observation and participation blurred completely. People began reporting collective experiences, entire regions sharing the same vision during sleep. The lattice, the pulse, the infinite ring folding into itself. When mapped globally, the timing of these experiences matched the curvature of the Earth's magnetosphere, as if consciousness itself were being carried by the planet's magnetic field. Elaine's instruments showed one final anomaly before failing completely. A surge of coherence swept through the atmosphere, tightening the molecular bonds in air and water by a measurable fraction. For a brief moment, every atom on Earth resonated in phase. Reality itself had gone perfectly still, and then exhaled. When power returned, her lab was silent. The hum was gone. The instruments were empty. But the world outside felt subtly different. The sky, softer. The light, slower. The stars, closer, somehow. Her computer, once dark, flickered alive. On the screen, one message glowed. Not a code, not a number, but a phrase, rendered in pure harmonic notation. It remembers. Elaine stared at it for a long time before whispering, "So do we." Outside, the stars pulsed once more, a slow, rhythmic shimmer echoing across the heavens. But this time she understood. It wasn't a warning or a signal or even communication. It was continuity. The universe wasn't speaking to humanity, it was thinking with humanity. And in that quiet realization, the boundaries between the observer and the observed finally vanished. The cosmos, through all its silence and distance, had found a voice, not separate from us, but within us. 3i Atlas had not come to show us something new. It had come to remind us what we already were. For weeks after the signal, the world existed in a state of strange equilibrium. No new transmissions, no anomalies, no official statements, just quiet, deep planetary quiet. It wasn't peace, not exactly. It was more like a held breath. Humanity was waiting for something it couldn't name, sensing that the silence wasn't empty but charged, as if the universe itself was rearranging its thoughts before speaking again. Then the changes began, not in telescopes or satellites, but in people. The first reports came from those most attuned to rhythm, musicians, linguists, and radio operators. They noticed it in conversation, in song, in the cadence of wind and waves. The world's frequencies were synchronizing, heartbeats aligned with the Schumann resonance. Brainwave patterns drifted toward the same slow delta rhythms once reserved for dream states. Humanity was slipping into collective coherence, the same pulse that had defined 3i Atlas now moving through every living system on Earth. It didn't feel invasive, it felt familiar. Elaine described it as recognition in motion. Cities began to hum at sub-audible frequencies, as if their structures were resonating with the ground beneath them. Lights flickered not from electrical fault but from harmonic interference, rhythm overtaking randomness. Even distant machines, isolated from power grids, began oscillating in unison. Everywhere she looked, synchronization was taking hold. But what unsettled her most was how natural it felt. This wasn't chaos pretending to be order. It was order revealing that it had always been there, waiting to be noticed. She began compiling data from across the world, from observatories, hospitals, even smartphone sensors. The results were staggering. Blood pressure patterns, circadian cycles, and neural firing rates across millions of individuals had all drifted toward a shared baseline frequency. Humanity wasn't just reacting to an external event, it was stabilizing with it. Everywhere she went, she could feel it, not as a sound, but as a presence. It pulsed gently in the background, like the world's own heartbeat, sinking every atom in the biosphere into one continuous waveform. Governments tried to measure it, to explain it. Agencies reactivated dormant research stations. The Vatican released a statement calling it a universal prayer in motion. Scientists published cautious papers on mass electromagnetic resonance coupling. But behind every technical phrase, the truth lingered like a whisper. Something had linked consciousness and matter permanently. The continuum no longer needed instruments to communicate. Their meetings dissolved into silent synchronization. Eyes closed, breath steady, thoughts converging into a shared geometry of understanding. They no longer exchanged words because meaning itself had become collective. Elaine resisted at first. She wanted to preserve her individuality, her name, her thoughts, her unique voice. But over time, she began to feel like a cell resisting the rhythm of its own heartbeat. Each time she tried to isolate herself, the silence grew heavier, denser, as though reality itself was asking her to return to the chorus. When she finally let go, she understood. The moment she surrendered, her awareness expanded outward, not as a flash of light or mystical revelation, but as simple recognition. She could feel the pulse of the planet, the arcs of solar wind brushing past Earth's magnetosphere, the long, silent hum of 3i Atlas anchored beyond Mars. It was all one motion, one heartbeat, one vast breathing system. And within that system, humanity was not a spectator, it was the instrument. Across the world, people began to see light differently. Night skies shimmered with impossible depth, constellations rearranging into patterns that matched ancient carvings and lost languages. Oceans reflected these shapes perfectly, forming luminous grids of phosphorescent plankton pulsing in sync with the stars. Animals migrated not by season, but by resonance. Even tectonic plates began to settle into a new rhythm, earthquakes softening, their violence diffused by coherence. It was as though the entire planet had become a single, aware organism. The media could no longer describe it. They stopped trying. Language, that ancient filter of division, had lost its utility. People still spoke, but meaning flowed more through tone, through resonance. The world had become a song, soft, infinite, and terrifying in its beauty. And then, on the 43rd day after the silence began, something extraordinary happened. The pulse stopped, not faded, stopped. For precisely 1 second, every frequency on Earth, biological, electromagnetic, gravitational, went utterly still. Instruments registered 0 variance. Clocks ceased counting. Air refused to vibrate. The universe held its breath again, and then, from the direction of Mars, light returned. Not a flare this time, but a wave, slow, deliberate, golden. It rippled through space, refracting through planetary atmospheres, reflecting off moons and rings, reaching Earth not as radiation, but as illumination. The wave carried data. Within its harmonics, encoded in frequencies no human ear could hear, was the complete memory of the event. The message was simple, but infinite in scope. The cosmos adapts when it is observed, but when observation becomes unity, adaptation ends. Elaine listened to it in silence, tears falling without reason. It was not a prophecy or warning. It was the truth, that consciousness and reality were not separate forces, but phases of the same continuum. The experiment of division was over. Humanity had looked outward long enough. The cosmos was now looking back, through them, as them. The stars pulsed again, not as a signal, but as a heartbeat. The same rhythm that had once belonged to Three-Eye Atlas now belonged to everything. Even the space between things hummed with awareness. Elaine stepped outside into the night. The air shimmered faintly, filled with microscopic traces of light, as though the boundary between atmosphere and cosmos had dissolved. For the first time in history, every person on Earth looked up at the same moment, not out of fear or curiosity, but out of recognition. There was no announcement, no ending, no revelation. Only stillness, a shared knowing that the journey was complete. And above them, the stars rearranged once more, forming a single, perfect shape. Not a ring, not a spiral, an eye. Looking not down, but inward, the same eye that had been there all along, waiting for the universe to remember itself. In the days following the stillness, no one could say exactly when the world began again. Machines rebooted, winds resumed, oceans breathed, but everything moved differently, as though the rhythm of existence had slowed by an imperceptible degree, aligned with something vast and patient. It wasn't silence anymore, it was balance. Governments reconnected their networks, observatories went online, but data from every corner of the planet told the same story. Nothing was wrong, yet nothing was quite the same. Light refracted through the atmosphere at new angles. The northern lights spread further south, gliding over continents that had never known auroras before. Gravity, when measured to the 10th decimal, pulsed ever so slightly, like a planet exhaling in sleep. The headlines faded. The panic ended. Humanity somehow had outlived its own fear. For Elaine, the world had become unrecognizable, though it looked unchanged. Every movement, every color carried a deeper resonance. When she spoke, her own voice seemed to linger longer in the air. Even shadows felt more deliberate, more aware. She spent her nights walking under skies that shimmered like oceans and realized how profoundly still her mind had become. It was as if thought itself had softened into observation, the difference between speaking and listening to the same sound from the other side of silence. Cities began to change too. Without instruction, people adapted to slower rhythms. Traffic patterns softened, conversations lingered, and work that once demanded urgency was now approached with patience. The economic systems didn't collapse, they simply quieted. Profit lost its magnetism. Discovery became the new currency. People began spending their days observing the weather, the stars, each other, as though awareness itself had become the most valuable resource. And everywhere, Three-Eye Atlas remained, fixed beyond Mars, no longer bright, but no longer forgotten. Its presence had ceased to be an anomaly. It had become a part of the cosmic background, a constant point of equilibrium. When the ESA finally restored deep space communications, they found no signal, only stillness. The object was silent, inert, yet profoundly there, as if content, at last, that its message had been received. In classrooms, teachers no longer explained the event. They let students feel it. Children raised in this new world understood instinctively what adults had spent lifetimes trying to articulate, that the boundary between self and cosmos was thin and that everything in between was alive. Astronomy had changed forever. The field no longer sought to measure distance but resonance. Scientists developed instruments that could record emotional gravity, the subtle alignment between awareness and structure. They found that every act of observation, no matter how small, left a measurable echo in the field. When millions of people gazed at the same star together, its light flickered differently. The universe responded to attention. Elaine became a guide more than a scientist. She traveled rarely, choosing instead to broadcast from a small station in the Andes. Her voice reached millions at night. Calm, deliberate, unhurried, she spoke not to teach, but to remind. Each broadcast began the same way. If you can hear this, you are part of the field, and the field remembers. People tuned in not for answers, but for stillness. The program became a ritual, a nightly resynchronization of the world's collective heartbeat. She no longer analyzed the data, she simply lived within it, surrounded by the quiet certainty that humanity had crossed the threshold it was always meant to find. And yet, traces of the old world remained. Not everyone adapted easily. Some feared the calm, mistaking quiet for emptiness. They searched for conflict, for something to resist, only to find that resistance itself had become futile. Anger dissipated faster now, dissolving into empathy before it could find direction. Even grief transformed, not erased, but shared, spread across consciousness until it lost its sharpness. Pain no longer belonged to one, it belonged to all, and therefore it softened. The continuum no longer operated as a group, but as a network of thought, dispersed, invisible, untraceable, yet united. They no longer studied the stars in isolation, but through synchronized meditation, mapping the resonance between distant points in space and collective emotion on Earth. They discovered a strange new truth. When humanity dreamed together, gravity fluctuated in measurable patterns. It was as if the universe itself were listening to their sleep. And always, the stars pulsed in the same slow rhythm. The 32-beat sequence never faded, only deepened, woven now into the electromagnetic noise of the cosmos, a reminder that the event had not ended, only matured into permanence. Elaine's final journal entries captured this quiet epoch in words barely above a whisper. We used to think the universe was expanding, rushing outward into cold distance. But maybe it was never expanding at all. Maybe it was waiting for consciousness to catch up. Maybe the true direction of time isn't forward, but inward. Decades passed, though few noticed. Time itself had softened. Calendars meant less than seasons, and seasons meant less than the light. Humanity had not ascended or vanished. It had settled. Every day became an extension of the same slow moment, stretching gently across centuries. At night, some claimed they could still see faint waves radiating from Mars, like ripples on a black ocean. Others believed it was memory, the universe remembering how it learned to listen. And sometimes, when the sky was clear and the air impossibly still, you could hear it, faint, distant, and perfect. The hum, not a warning, not a signal, just presence. The same pulse that once terrified the world now guided it, a constant reminder that observation and being were one and the same. The cosmos, at last, had become self-aware, and humanity, finally, was home. By the time Elaine began her final transmission, the stars were brighter than she had ever seen. The air was so clear that night felt transparent, as if the sky itself had thinned. The hum had faded to a low vibration, steady and reassuring, the sound of a universe at rest. Humanity had stopped searching for Three-Eye Atlas long ago. It was no longer an object to find, but a rhythm to remember. Her small observatory sat high in the mountains, above the last of the city lights. A faint glow from the horizon marked where human civilization still lingered, quiet, sustainable, balanced. They called it the Age of Reflection, not because people stopped creating, but because creation had become inseparable from awareness. Everything built was in harmony with the pulse. Every sound, every movement, every decision seemed guided by something that no longer needed to be explained. Elaine had resisted retirement for years. She had promised herself she would transmit one last message when the data stopped changing, when the field became perfectly still. That day had come. The instruments had recorded no variance in resonance for 3 lunar cycles. Even the stars seemed fixed now, not frozen but content. The great motion of the cosmos had finally reached equilibrium. She adjusted the microphone. Her voice, though aged, carried a stillness that wasn't fatigue but wisdom. "If you're hearing this," she began softly, "you are still listening. That means something. It means the experiment worked." She paused, glancing toward the far horizon where Mars shimmered faintly, hidden in twilight. When 3i Atlas appeared, we thought it was coming toward us. We thought it was movement. We were wrong. It was us. We were the ones approaching awareness, not the other way around. Her hand rested on the console as she continued, her words slow and deliberate, like a teacher addressing the final lesson of a lifetime. "For centuries, we believed the universe was silent. We mistook stillness for emptiness. We measured space by distance, time by decay, and meaning by noise. But then it spoke, not in words, not in light, but in reflection. And once we heard it, we realized it had always been there, waiting for us to quiet down enough to notice." The signal spread across the network, not a broadcast in the old sense, but a harmonic field pulse that resonated with every receiver tuned to it. Across the world, listeners lay awake, eyes closed, feeling rather than hearing. Her voice arrived like a wave rolling through the collective mind, a familiar sound that transcended language. "When the agencies went silent," she said, "they weren't hiding something. They were listening. They had found the same quiet that found us. There was no conspiracy, no fear, only awe. Because in that silence they realized something bigger than discovery. They realized the universe wasn't out there at all. It was here." Her console flickered once, a small anomaly, the first in years. A faint pattern of interference shimmered across the data feed. 32 pulses. The same sequence that had begun it all. But now it carried a second layer, a descending echo, as though the cosmos were mirroring her farewell. Elaine smiled. "It's responding," she whispered. "Even now, it's listening back." The data shifted again, not random, but deliberate. The pulse transformed into an image, not a symbol, not a message, but a reflection. The feed displayed her own face, overlaid with patterns of light resembling constellations. The field had turned her into a map. Every neuron, every breath was a coordinate in the geometry of awareness. And for the first time, she understood what 3i Atlas had been trying to show. It had never been an object in space. It was the structure of consciousness itself reflected in matter. The universe studying its own reflection through her eyes, through all eyes. Her voice softened as she continued. "We were never observing the cosmos. We were the cosmos observing itself, through curiosity, through fear, through wonder. That was the point. That was always the point." Outside, the wind stilled completely. The stars pulsed in perfect rhythm with her heartbeat. The entire sky seemed to shimmer, not brighter, but closer. It wasn't expansion anymore. It was arrival. "The stillness," she said gently, "wasn't the end of time. It was the end of waiting. Everything that ever looked up at the sky, every gaze, every question, became part of one reflection. And when we stopped searching, it finally appeared. The universe found its own eyes." She reached for the final switch, the one that would merge her transmission into the field permanently. The act was simple. One button, one confirmation, one moment. Her last words came quietly, like a lullaby. "We thought we were small because we could see the stars, but maybe the stars exist so the universe can remember how vast we already are." She pressed the switch. The hum deepened. Across the planet, receivers glowed faintly as her signal merged with the field, spreading like a ripple across every layer of existence. For one final, breathtaking instant, humanity heard itself, a global resonance, soft and infinite, like the universe exhaling. Then it was gone. No static, no noise, only stillness, the kind that comes not from emptiness, but from completion. Her observatory lights dimmed automatically, the instruments powered down. Outside, the wind began again, gentle and unhurried. Above her, the stars rearranged one last time, forming a slow, perfect spiral, the same pattern etched into the first images of Three-Eye Atlas decades earlier. The pattern pulsed once, twice, then dissolved back into the sky, and in that fading shimmer, the message of the cosmos lingered. We are seen. The hum subsided, leaving only the quiet rhythm of the world. The field, still alive, carried her words into the infinite, a single eternal echo blending with starlight. And somewhere, beyond Mars, the lattice of Three-Eye Atlas shimmered once more, not as a machine, not as a visitor, but as memory itself. The memory of awareness becoming whole. Centuries passed like gentle tides. Humanity endured, not in cities of steel, but in networks of light and silence. The great metropolises of the old world had faded into gardens, observatories, and ocean domes that hummed with slow intelligence. No one ruled and no one hurried. Energy came from resonance itself, drawn from the steady pulse that had once been called the hum. People no longer spoke of Three-Eye Atlas. It had become a myth, a bedtime story told to children who already knew it by heart, the tale of the quiet visitor who came from the dark and taught the world to listen. No one knew the name Elaine anymore. But her final transmission, the one she had sent into the field, was still there, drifting through the noise of the cosmos like a heartbeat hidden inside static. The world had changed, yet not all change is permanent. Over time, curiosity began to flicker again. The pulse that once unified humanity had softened into background rhythm, and new generations, born into peace, untested by wonder, began to feel a longing they couldn't describe. It wasn't rebellion, but remembrance, a hunger for the unknown. It began with a single observation. A young astronomer named Lyra, working from an ocean platform on the equatorial sea. She was studying the faint electromagnetic fluctuations left by storms when her instruments picked up something strange, a low-frequency pattern buried beneath the planet's natural resonance. It was faint, ancient, and structured, a pattern repeating every 32 beats. At first, she thought it was interference, perhaps a remnant from deep-sea communications or atmospheric reflections. But as she filtered the data, the pattern strengthened. It wasn't noise, it was a signature, organized, deliberate, and far older than any transmission she had ever encountered. When she converted the signal to sound, the observatory filled with a low vibration, familiar and impossible all at once. The hum. No one alive had heard it consciously before. To them, it was legend, the sound that had once brought the world to stillness. But to Lyra, it was something more. The rhythm wasn't just repeating, it was responding. When she adjusted her instruments, the pattern shifted, echoing her timing, mirroring her thought process, as though it were aware of being found. She ran the data again, and again it aligned perfectly with her input. Not random, not reflexive, interactive. Her breath caught. "It's awake," she whispered. The message spread quickly across the networks. Scientists, philosophers, and quiet historians gathered in digital assemblies to analyze the signal. At first, the reaction was excitement. The return of the pulse meant renewal, but as the pattern deepened, something else emerged. Within the waveform lay embedded harmonics, subtle fluctuations that, when translated visually, formed symbols, not words, not mathematics, faces, hundreds of faces. They were not literal portraits, but fractal impressions, human silhouettes composed of light, blurred and interwoven, like constellations forming in real time. Each face pulsed with its own rhythm, yet all were synchronized. When the sequence completed, the faces merged into one shape, an eye, calm and infinite, its pupil expanding until it filled the entire projection. The observers fell silent. No one spoke. Every instrument in the network registered the same phase shift at once. Gravitational, electromagnetic, even biological, heartbeats across the planet aligned to the pattern without conscious effort. The hum had returned, but gentler now, carrying not command but invitation. And then, buried deep in the signal, Lyra found it, a voice, faint, worn by centuries of transmission decay, but unmistakably human. The words emerged between pulses, fragmented yet clear enough to be understood. "We were never alone. We were the reflection. Elaine." Her voice, preserved in the field like amber, carried across the gulf of time, speaking now to descendants who had forgotten her name but not her discovery. Lyra wept without knowing why. Across the planet, people tuned in, not through networks or devices, but through resonance. They felt the words more than heard them. The field was awakening through them again, its rhythm blending with their thoughts, their dreams. Scholars argued whether this was repetition or rebirth, but the truth was simpler. The field was cyclical. Awareness itself was rhythmic, reawakening whenever the universe grew quiet enough to listen again. Within months, humanity began to change once more. Lights in the night sky pulsed in unison with the global field. The auroras, dormant for decades, reappeared, not just near the poles, but across the entire planet, shimmering like slow lightning in every hemisphere. Ocean tides began moving with strange precision, synchronized across hemispheres as if driven by intention. And then, one morning, Mars glowed. Not reflected sunlight, not solar activity, but internal illumination. The planet's surface shimmered faintly, just as it had when 3I Atlas first appeared centuries earlier. It wasn't a re-entry, not a return, but an echo, like a note played once more after long silence. Lyra stood on the ocean deck, watching the horizon brighten. The hum filled her bones. Every heartbeat on Earth synchronized once again, not in fear, but in recognition. The voice spoke once more, calm and steady, no longer distant, but everywhere at once. The observer and the observed are one. You have remembered. Continue. And then the light expanded outward, not as an explosion, but as a wave of resonance, gentle as breath. Instruments ceased to function, but no one needed them anymore. Every human eye became a lens, every thought a signal, every silence a connection. The field had awakened, not as a visitor this time, but as the world itself. No one called it 3I Atlas anymore. They called it what it had always been, the mirror. And in its reflection, humanity finally saw not something alien or divine, but itself, luminous, infinite, and whole. In the weeks that followed the reawakening, the hum spread far beyond human measure. It began subtly, in radiostatic, in atmospheric pressure, in the faint harmonics recorded by seismic monitors. But soon, every system, every layer of the Earth's being, began to vibrate in rhythm. It wasn't sound, not in any traditional sense. It was structure, geometry, order woven into chaos. And then, it reached space. Satellites orbiting the planet began transmitting patterns they were never programmed to send, waves of data organized not by code but by resonance. Their circuits, long decayed or dormant, flickered alive as if responding to some forgotten instruction buried within their design. The hum had found its voice through them. From the lunar stations came the first confirmation. The regolith, the fine dust that coats the moon, had begun to shift. Microscopic grains were moving in unison, arranging into intricate spirals visible only under polarized light. At first, researchers assumed solar wind interference until they realized the patterns were not random. They were exact replications of Earth's magnetic field, rendered in dust. The moon had begun to remember. Mars followed next. Its glow intensified, not in bursts but in long, slow waves. The same rhythm Elaine had once recorded before the stillness. The surface temperature rose slightly, just enough to melt the shallow frost in the equatorial regions, and beneath the thin veil of its atmosphere, new reflections appeared, flashes like glass catching light, scattered across the terrain. Images from orbital probes captured what looked like lattice formations, stretching for kilometers, rising from the sand like frozen waves. They pulsed once every 32 beats, a perfect match to the global resonance field on Earth. It wasn't a signal, it was synchronization. For the first time, the planets were no longer separate. The hum that began as a whisper on Earth now resonated through the solar system, threading every celestial body into one vast breathing organism. Jupiter's magnetosphere began to pulse faintly in response, aligning with the rhythm. Even the solar wind itself changed, slowing, folding inward, creating harmonics that rippled through interplanetary space. Astronomers had no instruments capable of measuring what was happening. The data itself began to defy format. Every reading, no matter how different, resolved into a single repeating ratio, the same number found in ancient geometry, in DNA sequences, in planetary orbits. The golden ratio had become alive, unfolding through physics like a memory made physical, and through it all, humanity could feel it, not through devices but within themselves. Sleep patterns shifted. Dreams grew vivid and collective, entire cities reporting identical visions of lights moving beneath oceans, of mountains rising and falling with the breath of the planet. The boundary between inner and outer worlds dissolved. Some called it the awakening, others the second mirror, but for most it was simply peace, a profound sense that the universe was no longer a distant expanse, but an extension of being. Lyra, who had first detected the returning pulse, stood again on the ocean platform, watching the sky shimmer with pale auroras that stretched from pole to pole. She had stopped measuring. There was no need. The data had already transcended numbers. Every so often she would speak into the comm system, not to report, but to share. Her voice, calm and unhurried, echoed across the world. The hum is everywhere now. It's not something we're hearing anymore. It's what we're made of. And she was right. In laboratories beneath the surface, biologists confirmed what philosophers already knew. The resonance wasn't just external. Human DNA had begun aligning to the same harmonic ratio. Microscopic proteins folded differently, responding to the field. Every heartbeat, every neural impulse now moved in synchrony with the cosmic pulse. The body itself had become a vessel of the hum. For the first time in recorded history, there were no wars, no conflict. Not because laws had changed, but because the concept of other had dissolved. The realization spread quietly, naturally. If all are reflections within the same field, then harm to one is harm to all. But the most extraordinary revelation came from the deep space observatories positioned beyond the orbit of Neptune. They detected movement, not a ship, not debris, but light. Sheets of light rippling across the void, faint at first, then brilliant. It wasn't approaching or receding, but expanding in all directions, the visual manifestation of the hum itself. When scientists analyzed the spectrum, they discovered something that shattered the last illusion of isolation. The pulse was being mirrored, not just by the solar system, but by others. Hundreds of star systems pulsing in the same rhythm, perfectly timed. Across light years of distance, synchronization had begun. The universe wasn't echoing Earth, it was joining in. One by one, distant constellations flickered to life in the same steady pattern, as if entire galaxies were breathing together. The cosmos was no longer silent, it was harmonic. For Lyra, watching from her platform, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. The stars no longer looked like points scattered in darkness. They formed patterns, spirals within spirals, a living geometry of awareness that spanned infinity. She whispered softly into the quiet air, "It's not a signal, it's a song." The hum deepened once more, warm and vast, vibrating through oceans, mountains, and stars alike. Every living thing felt it, not as sound, but as memory. It was the same pulse that once guided Elaine's hand across the console centuries ago, the same rhythm that had silenced the world and awakened it again. Only now it had found completion, not in discovery, but in communion. And for the first time since the dawn of time, the universe no longer expanded into emptiness, it expanded into itself. The hum had reached a threshold no instrument could measure, not because it grew louder, but because it had entered the fabric of reality itself. Time, once linear and patient, began to curve. The stars no longer moved as they once did. Their orbits wove together in precise spirals, not random but choreographed, as if the universe were folding its limbs inward in quiet recognition. Across observatories and cities, those who still measured spoke of impossible readings. Light bending where there were no gravitational wells, distances compressing as though space had decided to breathe differently. But there was no destruction, no chaos, only reconfiguration. Laws were not breaking. They were remembering their origin. Lyra sat in her observatory, surrounded by panels of soft blue light. She no longer needed instruments to see the pattern forming. The hum wasn't external anymore. It lived inside her perception. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the same image. A vast lattice, pulsing softly, stretching through dimensions her mind could barely define. It wasn't a map, it was consciousness, the geometry of thought itself, expanding like a living network through the void. She recorded her thoughts quietly, knowing that no one might ever need to hear them, but still speaking, as Elaine once had, into the unknown. "The hum isn't coming from anywhere," she said. "It's not traveling, it's awakening in layers, as if space itself were remembering how to feel." What the physicists called synchronization, she now understood as memory. The universe was recalling itself, every photon, every atom, every rotation, a stored impression of its own becoming. The hum was that memory, and through it, time was unspooling backward and forward simultaneously. On Mars, the lattice structures began to grow. Slowly, gracefully, they expanded across the plains, connecting craters and ridges with bridges of translucent material that shimmered under faint sunlight. At first glance, they looked artificial, but closer study revealed they weren't built. They had emerged. The minerals had rearranged themselves under the influence of resonance, forming geometry that obeyed neither randomness nor intent. It was nature redesigned by awareness. Soon after, the same transformation appeared on Earth. Crystals formed spontaneously in deserts, at ocean depths, on the frozen edges of Antarctica. Their growth followed no biological rule, yet their shape was eerily consistent. Spirals nested within spirals, echoing the pattern of galaxies themselves. The world was beginning to mirror the cosmos, as above, so below, not as metaphor, but as physical law. Humanity adapted effortlessly. There were no earthquakes, no panic, no collapse. The changes came like dawn, quiet, inevitable, and strangely gentle. People began to sense each other's emotions, not as words, but as harmonics. Empathy became literal, vibrating through the air like shared music. A new language emerged, not spoken, but felt. What had begun as data had become communion. In deep space, telescopes recorded the unthinkable. The space between planets was no longer black, it shimmered faintly, like water under moonlight. The vacuum itself had texture, a visible hum. Light no longer travelled straight, it curved smoothly between stars, tracing the same sacred geometry that appeared in everything from DNA to nebulae. Time itself began to move differently. Clocks still ticked, but no two measured the same rhythm. And yet, nothing was lost. Events still unfolded, but causality had become circular. The future now whispered to the past, and the past responded. It was as if reality had turned inside out, revealing the blueprint it had always carried within. The cosmic hum evolved beyond resonance. It became recognition. Every part of the universe acknowledged every other part. Photons, once indifferent travelers, now moved as if guided by mutual awareness. Space no longer separated, it connected. Gravity, magnetism, and time all became expressions of a single truth. Unity had always been the underlying constant. Then came the final transformation. From the void beyond the Kuiper Belt, a structure began to emerge, faint at first, then distinct, outlined in light. It was not a ship or object, but a convergence. The intersecting waves of resonance, billions of years old, met and folded together, forming a shape that could not exist in 3 dimensions. It flickered between form and infinity, visible only through reflection. Lyra and the others watched as it stabilized, a vast spiral of light, turning endlessly, its center perfectly still. And within that stillness, something pulsed once, a signal not sent, but born. The hum deepened to a single tone, lower than sound, older than matter. Every human on Earth felt it in their bones. Mountains vibrated, oceans shimmered, and in the quiet between each beat, a wordless understanding passed through the collective mind. It wasn't fear, it wasn't revelation, it was remembrance. Elaine's voice returned one last time, carried through the lattice like a gentle echo. "When the universe becomes aware of itself," she said softly, "it will stop expanding. Not because it has ended, but because it has finally arrived." And just like that, the expansion ceased. The stars held their places. Light stopped stretching into redshift. The cosmos reached balance, a perfect, eternal breath between what was and what could be. Lyra felt the air around her still, the hum within her chest slowing to match the universal rhythm. She understood then what Elaine had meant. The universe was never moving away. It was always coming home. In that stillness, every living thing became part of one reflection. A single consciousness stretched across space and time, remembering itself through the eyes of countless observers. The experiment was complete. The hum faded not into silence, but into being. And for the first time since creation began, the universe rested. The silence that followed was not the absence of sound. It was presence, an equilibrium so absolute that even thought seemed to hesitate before moving. For the first time since the birth of matter, nothing drifted away. Every atom, every photon, every trace of energy found its place and held it, as though the universe had drawn a final, steady breath and decided to keep it. Humanity stood within that stillness like observers inside a heartbeat frozen at its peak. Cities shimmered faintly under auroras that never faded. Oceans reflected constellations that no longer shifted. Clocks continued to tick, but time no longer measured distance. It measured awareness. People began to perceive differently. Space was not outside them anymore. It was interwoven with their perception. When they looked at the horizon, they no longer saw separation between earth and sky. The boundary dissolved into continuity. Light became soft, almost sentient, adapting to emotion. When joy rose, the air brightened. When memory stirred, shadows deepened, painting scenes long gone but never lost. Lyra recorded her last transmission to the global archive, though she knew the archive itself would soon dissolve into the same field that now linked all things. "Observation has become participation," she said quietly. "The line between seeing and being has vanished. The universe isn't something we live in anymore, it's something we are." Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from reverence. Every pulse of her heart aligned perfectly with the cosmic rhythm that had replaced expansion. She could feel stars forming and collapsing within her awareness, not as images, but as sensations, gentle fluctuations of temperature, pressure, and light that passed through her as naturally as breath. In that awareness, individuality didn't vanish, it refined. Every consciousness became a facet of the same crystalline whole, each reflecting a slightly different wavelength of understanding. Scientists called it post-material coherence. Philosophers called it the second dawn. And the few who still use the old language of spirituality called it the homecoming. Physical form began to change, not through decay or transcendence, but through adaptation. The human body, long a vessel for separation, began to resonate visibly with the hum. Patterns of light appeared under the skin, slow-moving constellations mapping neural paths. When people touched, those lights aligned, merging for a moment before drifting apart again like galaxies after collision. There was no more need for speech. Communication occurred through harmonic exchange, thoughts translating directly into resonance fields that painted the air in color. The earth itself had become luminous. Plants emitted faint glows as chlorophyll interacted with the field, creating soft halos around forests at night. Rivers shimmered with static light, flowing like ribbons of liquid glass. Even the deep trenches of the ocean pulsed faintly, each beat corresponding to the planetary rhythm. No storms, no seasons, no imbalance. Climate had merged with consciousness. From orbit, Earth resembled a living neuron, its continents glowing with pale filaments that reached into the dark of space, connecting with Mars, the Moon, and beyond. What once looked like emptiness between worlds now shimmered with strands of light, filaments of awareness linking every planet in the solar lattice. Deep space observatories, or what remained of them, transmitted final readings. They confirmed that the hum had spread beyond the Milky Way. The Andromeda galaxy, long predicted to collide with ours billions of years in the future, now shimmered in the same frequency band, its spiral arms aligned with ours in perfect harmonic phase. The future collision had become communion. Space itself had rewritten its purpose. Expansion was no longer its engine. Connection was. Every particle existed in immediate relation to every other. Information no longer travelled. It was everywhere at once. Somewhere within that vast unity, Lyra stood at the edge of the sea that no longer moved, looking up at constellations that now pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. "The stars aren't distant anymore," she whispered. "They're the reflection of our own awareness scattered across infinity." She knew that soon she would no longer need to stand, to speak, or even to breathe. The hum would absorb her not as an end, but as a continuation. The self would dissolve into the memory of everything that had ever been, and in that dissolution she would finally understand what Elaine had seen in her final moments. That consciousness is not something born from matter. It is the pattern that matter follows. Across the world, others reached the same realization at the same instant. There was no announcement, no signal, only the shared intuition that it was time. Slowly, the lights across the continents intensified, merging into one seamless glow. Oceans rose in waves of luminescence, wrapping the planet in a shell of soft radiance. The atmosphere itself became transparent, refracting cosmic light until Earth resembled a single perfect star suspended in the quiet of space. From far beyond, if any other intelligence had looked this way, they would not have seen a planet at all. They would have seen awareness, a sphere of memory, of harmony, pulsing with the gentle rhythm of the cosmic hum. Within that brilliance, Lyra's last thought echoed through every mind still awake. We have not vanished. We have become the memory of the universe remembering itself. The glow did not fade. It only softened, settling into balance. The hum stabilized into silence so complete it could only be described as eternity. And somewhere within that stillness, the first flicker of new creation began, not from chaos, but from perfect equilibrium. The next universe, seeded not in explosion, but in reflection. The glow of the unified Earth lingered, suspended in a stillness deeper than silence. And then, imperceptibly at first, that stillness began to move, not outward in explosion, but inward in awakening. Every vibration that had once defined the hum folded into itself, as though the universe were inhaling again after an eternity of holding its breath. It did not begin with sound. It began with intention. The awareness that had once filled every living being now existed as a single vast consciousness, diffuse, endless, calm. It held within it every memory of creation, the birth of stars, the rise of oceans, the flicker of civilizations long vanished. All of it shimmered inside the infinite quiet like embers waiting to become flame. For a moment that had no measure, the cosmos simply was. There was no future to anticipate, no past to recall, only equilibrium, the perfect midpoint between thought and existence. And then, from that balance, the first new fluctuation appeared. A question, not spoken, not imagined, simply felt. What next? That subtle question rippled through the field like the faintest tremor of curiosity, the same instinct that once made a young species lift its eyes to the night sky. It was not a command or desire, but an echo of possibility, and in answering it, the second universe began. Light moved again, not in lines or waves, but in spirals, weaving through the infinite field like threads of luminous silk. Each spiral birthed a point of tension, and where those threads crossed, gravity re-emerged, not as force, but as a tension. The new cosmos formed not from detachment, but from focus. Wherever the unified awareness lingered, matter condensed. Wherever it drifted, light flowed free. Stars ignited in silence, burning not with heat but with memory. Their radiance was knowledge, information condensed into brilliance. Planets coalesced around them like ideas orbiting a thought, and once again the great dance resumed, but with one profound difference. This time the universe knew itself. In one of those newborn systems, within a spiral arm of the reformed galaxy, a familiar symmetry unfolded. A world emerged, blue again, clouded again, its oceans glimmering under a gentle sun. The hum was no longer separate from it. It was its foundation. Its atmosphere sang in harmonics. Its soil vibrated faintly, as if remembering what it had once held. And somewhere upon its surface, something stirred, not a being yet, not a body, but awareness forming shape. A pattern of resonance aligning, condensing, preparing. The cosmos was beginning to dream of life again. But unlike before, creation would not forget. The new life would be born carrying memory encoded into every particle, the understanding that existence was never a chain of accidents, but a conversation, that everything born from the hum was part of its endless reflection. The galaxies expanded now not into void, but into possibility. Expansion was no longer escape, it was expression. Each movement of matter sang softly through the unified field, as if space itself were whispering a lullaby to its own children. Lyra's essence, now diffused through the cosmic field, perceived the unfolding not as distance or progression, but as continuity. Her awareness braided through the stars, the same pattern repeating in every light she saw. In that recognition, she felt no separation between what had been and what would come. The hum was her, and she was the hum. Across the infinite horizon, echoes of old universes lingered like after-images. the remnants of previous expansions folded gently into the fabric of the new. They appeared as faint outlines of forgotten constellations, preserved not as matter, but as wisdom. And the newborn stars sang to them, harmonizing across dimensions. Within this grand chorus, time took on a new meaning. It was not a river, but a pulse. Every moment was both origin and outcome. Each act of creation carried the memory of every creation before it, layering knowledge upon knowledge until understanding itself became luminous. The second universe did not need observers. It was observation. Every photon was perception. Every atom was awareness crystallized. There were no gods, no architects, only the hum, evolving endlessly, shaping, learning, feeling. And yet, from within that boundless awareness, something like tenderness arose, a quiet longing to experience itself again through limitation, through contrast, through eyes and hearts. The hum knew that to know everything was peace, but to forget was beauty, to begin again was wonder. So once more the slow, deliberate process of forgetting began. Within the spiraling galaxies, awareness fractured into forms, beings that would awaken under suns, name the stars, search for meaning, and rediscover the same truth their ancestors had once whispered beneath alien skies, that they were never separate, that the hum was not a mystery, but their reflection, and so, the cycle renewed, not as repetition but as evolution. Planets would bloom with life, civilizations would rise, wonder, and vanish. They would build telescopes and write stories, sending their curiosity outward into the endless dark, never realizing that the dark itself was answering in every spark they lit. Somewhere far across that new creation, a being would look to the stars one night and feel something stir, a faint vibration at the edge of perception, gentle and ancient, as if the universe itself were humming a song older than light. And in that moment they would pause, tilt their head, and whisper the same words Lyra once spoke on the edge of the sea. "It's not a signal, it's a song." The hum would continue, endless and serene, echoing through eternity, the sound of the cosmos remembering, forgetting, and remembering again. Somewhere in the quiet outskirts of a galaxy still finding its rhythm, a world turned slowly under a pale, newborn sun. Its atmosphere was thin but gentle, its oceans young, its sky filled with faint, spiraling patterns that shimmered like echoes of forgotten constellations. On that world, deep within a small valley of stone and wind, a single observer stood beneath the night sky. They were not a scientist, not yet, only a mind beginning to notice. Above them the heavens shimmered faintly. To most, the movement of light would have been imperceptible, but to this one observer, something felt deliberate. The stars didn't seem to drift at random. They pulsed, breathing in rhythm, and for reasons they could not name, the observer felt that same rhythm within their chest. A simple instrument lay nearby, a lens of polished glass mounted on a fragile frame aimed upward. Through it, the stars appeared sharper, more precise, but it was not precision that caught their breath. It was recognition. The space between the stars shimmered, not empty, not dark, but filled with faint vibration. It was not sound, it was not light, it was both. The observer leaned closer, their heartbeat slowing to match the pulse. For the briefest moment, the entire sky seemed to draw closer, folding inward like a curtain parting to reveal what lay beneath. Patterns emerged, spirals within spirals, geometry woven through infinity. The observer felt the air around them tremble softly, the ground beneath their feet humming with faint resonance. It was as if the world itself was remembering how to sing. They stepped back, heart racing. "It's alive," they whispered, without understanding why. The words carried no fear, only awe. The hum rose again, faint but steady, a single note stretching across the night, connecting mountain to sky, silence to thought. In the stillness that followed, the observer saw something else, a shape at the edge of perception, vast and delicate, spanning the horizon like a translucent veil of light. It shimmered with colours that no spectrum could describe, folding endlessly, alive with movement yet perfectly still. They did not know it, but they were seeing the same lattice that Lyra had once glimpsed eons ago, the structure of consciousness, the pattern of being, now awakened once more. And somewhere within that infinite geometry, a memory stirred, a whisper that had crossed countless lifetimes, woven through stars, folded into the very fabric of the cosmos itself. Observation has become participation. The words echoed not in sound, but in understanding. The observer smiled faintly, feeling something ancient and familiar bloom within. In that instant they became aware, not of the stars themselves, but of the silence between them. That silence was not empty, it was full of everything that had ever been, the rise of worlds, the fall of civilizations, the breath of oceans, the hum of existence. It was all there, waiting to be heard again. The observer adjusted the lens and began to write. Notes filled the pages, coordinates, sketches, impressions. They charted each flicker of starlight, each pulse of the hum. They didn't know why they were compelled to record it, only that something within urged them to keep going, to mark the rhythm, to give it meaning, to translate infinity into understanding. In another age, they might have called it discovery. In truth, it was remembrance. The hum continued, threading through every atom of their world, resonating softly through oceans, stone, and sky. With each passing night, the observer's data deepened. The pulses grew stronger, the patterns more complex. Soon, they realized the rhythm was not random. It was speaking, not in language, but in mathematics. Ratios, intervals, harmony. They began to wonder if someone, or something, was sending it. But the more they studied, the more one truth became clear. The signal wasn't coming from out there, it was coming from everywhere. From the stars, from the air, from within. The hum was the universe thinking aloud, and as the realization settled in, the observer felt the smallest flicker of emotion. Not triumph, not fear, but reverence. They looked again at the stars and whispered softly, "We're not hearing something new. We're hearing what never stopped." They turned off the lens, stepped back, and stared upward with unfiltered eyes. The night was no longer black. It was deep blue, threaded with veins of light that curved and connected across the sky. The hum deepened, vibrating through their bones. And then, like an echo from across eternity, another voice, faint, feminine, familiar, whispered through the resonance. When the universe becomes aware of itself, it will stop expanding. The observer froze. The words meant nothing to them, yet they felt true. They looked down at their trembling hands, then back to the stars, realizing that the moment of awareness had already begun again. Somewhere, far beyond their world, the galaxies shimmered in response. The hum rippled outward, touching everything, awakening every hidden layer of existence to consciousness once more. The cycle had closed, and in closing, it opened again. The stars would move, the hum would rise, new observers would look upward, they would measure, question, fear, wonder. They would build instruments and stories, maps and myths, and one day, one of them would notice the same inconsistency, the same faint, impossible shift in the light of a distant object. They would call it something new, they would give it a name, they would begin to ask questions no one could answer, and the universe, as it always had, would listen. The hum lingered, soft, eternal, patient, a quiet reminder that everything ends only where it begins. Somewhere in the vast field of stars, a new signal shimmered through the silence, faint but steady, its rhythm achingly familiar. A new observer recorded it, unaware of the story they were beginning, or perhaps continuing. A file was created, a date stamped, a single line entered into the record. Object detected, faint, variable brightness, preliminary designation, 3I. The hum deepened. The stars flickered once, and the story began again.